Section 1. The Fire That Never Dies Origins and the Eternal Oath. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the stars going dark. Not slowly, not one by one the way stars die across geological time. All at once. A sky that was full one moment becomes a void so complete and so absolute that the very idea of light seems like something you dreamed. That kind of darkness does not just press against you from the outside. It seeps in through the cracks, through fear, through doubt, through the smallest hesitation right before you ask yourself whether the fight is even worth it anymore. Now imagine, somewhere out there in that total, swallowing dark, a fleet of warships, black-hulled, running with the quiet hum of plasma reactors and the low rumble of engines that have been burning without rest for a very, very long time. And aboard those ships, warriors who have not stopped fighting since before your grandfather's grandfather was born. Warriors who have sworn, in the most literal and binding sense of the word, to never stop, to never rest, to carry the war forward across the galaxy until the last enemy of mankind has been burned to nothing. That is who the Black Templars are. And that vow is not metaphor. It is not the kind of stirring speech a commander gives to fire his troops up before battle. It is the actual founding principle of an entire chapter of Space Marines, renewed by every High Marshal who has ever taken the title for 10,000 years without a single break. 10,000 years of continuous crusade. Let that number sit with you for a moment, before we go any further, because the scale of it is the key to understanding everything else about these warriors and what their lives actually look like from the inside. To understand where the Black Templars came from, you have to go back to the bloodiest moment in the history of the Imperium of Man, the Horus Heresy, the great civil war that nearly ended humanity before it even reached for the stars. When the War Master Horus turned half the Space Marine legions to the service of the Chaos Gods and launched the most catastrophic war the galaxy had seen, the Imperial fists stood at the walls of Terra itself and refused to yield. They were siege fighters, builders of fortresses, sons of the Primarch Rogel Dorn, a man whose idea of commitment was to have himself crucified on the shattered hull of a ship just to prove a point about sacrifice. Their first captain at that time was a warrior named Sigismund. We'll spend a great deal of time on him later, because you genuinely cannot understand the Black Templars without understanding this one man. But for now, the relevant thing is what happened during the Siege of Terra. The enemy was at the gates. Champions of chaos had risen from within the ranks of the traitors. Monstrous figures clad in corrupted armor, empowered by warp energy and centuries of hate. Someone needed to meet them in single combat. Someone needed to walk out in front of the Emperor's own palace walls and break them, one by one, so the line would hold. Rogel Dorn chose Sigismund. He gave him the best armor. He gave him the finest weapons. And Sigismund walked out and did exactly what was asked of him, challenging and defeating over 24 champions of chaos in personal combat across the course of that terrible siege. He became the first Emperor's champion, a tradition that carries on to this very day in ways we'll get into later. But the moment that matters right now is what came after the heresy ended. The war was won. Horus was dead. The Emperor lay broken and dying on his golden throne, barely alive in a way that made death look like a mercy. And in the aftermath, the Primarch Robut Guilliman of the Ultramarines proposed that the Space Marine legions, each numbering in the tens of thousands of warriors, were too dangerous to be left in their current form. One man with that kind of force behind him could topple everything that had just barely survived. So Guilliman wrote the Codex Astartes, the great treatise on warfare and organization, which decreed that each legion would be broken down into chapters of approximately 1,000 warriors each, spread across the galaxy, never again to be concentrated under a single banner. Rogel Dorn hated this idea. He called Guilliman a coward to his face for not having stood at Terra. The argument between these two Primarchs was enough that it came close to starting a second civil war before it was even resolved. When Dorn finally relented, he did so with the bitterness of a man who had just watched the greatest force for human protection in history be deliberately dismembered. Sigismund took this personally. He gathered the most zealous of the Imperial fists around him, the brothers who burned with a faith so intense that even a decade of the most brutal war in human history had only refined it further, and he made a promise. He assembled a war fleet and announced an eternal crusade, a single unbroken campaign that would last until the chapter's loyalty to the Emperor was proven beyond any shadow of doubt. He swore, in the most binding terms he could conceive, to never rest in the prosecution of his duties against the enemies of the Emperor. And so the Black Templars were born, not from a comfortable appointment or a calm transfer of authority, from a furious, burning oath made by a man who had just seen everything he believed in nearly destroyed, and who had decided that the only possible response was to fight harder for the rest of his immortal life. The chapter took on the black and white of Sigismund's personal heraldry. The Black Cross, the Maltese Cross, became their symbol. They rejected the Codex Astartes in a structural sense, organizing themselves not into companies, but into crusades, led by marshals, with the High Marshal commanding all from aboard the Eternal Crusader. They established chapter keeps on every world they conquered, not as a home base, but as recruiting stations and staging posts, places to replenish the crusade and bring in the next generation of warriors before moving on. They have no homeworld. They have never had one. Their home is the fleet. Their family is the crusade. And their purpose, renewed every time a new High Marshal takes the title, is the same oath Sigismund made on the day they launched into the dark. No pity, no remorse, no fear. If that sounds brutal, it is. And we are only just getting started. If you've made it this far, you're exactly the kind of person who deserves to know what happens next. Drop a comment below and tell me where in the world you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I genuinely love knowing who's on the other end of this, whether you're listening at midnight in your room or having this on in the background during a long drive. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. There's a lot more where this came from, and I'd rather you not miss it. Section 2. Blood of Dorn, the gene seed, the organs, and the body that becomes a weapon. Before we can talk about what the life of a Black Templar actually looks like on a day-to-day basis, we need to spend some time inside the process that creates one. Because a Space Marine is not a soldier in any sense that you'd recognize from your own world. A Space Marine is a different kind of organism, rebuilt from the inside out by a program of biological engineering, so ambitious and so brutal that the process itself kills a significant percentage of those who attempt it. Every Space Marine is built from gene seed. These are engineered biological organs, grown from the original genetic template of a Primarch, and implanted progressively into a human adolescent male over the course of years. The gene seed of the Black Templars comes from Rogel Dorn, the Primarch of the Imperial Fists. What that means in practical terms is that every Black Templar carries a fragment of Dorn's biology inside him, a set of organs grown from his genetic material, expressing themselves differently in each warrior, but always tracing back to that one ancient original source. The process does not happen all at once. It cannot. The human body would reject it. What happens instead is a careful, progressive sequence of implantations that starts with the organs most likely to be tolerated and works toward the more exotic and demanding ones as the recruit's physiology adapts. The first thing to change is usually the secondary heart. This is exactly what it sounds like. The recruit receives a second, smaller heart that works in tandem with the original. If one fails, the other sustains life. If both are functioning, the circulatory system operates at a level of efficiency that makes the recipient significantly harder to kill from blood loss or cardiac shock. For a warrior who will be regularly shot at, stabbed, and struck with weapons that would reduce an ordinary person to a red smear on a wall, this matters enormously. The osmotic gill comes next, an organ that allows the warrior to extract oxygen from water and survive underwater environments. The biscopia alters the musculoskeletal structure, accelerating the growth of muscle tissue beyond what natural development could achieve, and beginning the slow process of turning the recruit into something that can lift a vehicle with its bare hands. The hemastamen modifies the blood itself, turning it into a far more complex fluid that carries oxygen, nutrients, and biological information more efficiently than baseline human blood. Then there are the oolitic kidney and the neuroglottis, which filter the body with a level of precision that makes the Space Marine effectively immune to most toxins, venoms, and diseases that would incapacitate or kill a normal human being. The enhanced olfactory senses of the neuroglottis allow them to identify individuals by scent, detect subtle chemical signals in the air, and gather information about a battlefield environment that ordinary soldiers would simply miss. The oculobe modifies the eyes themselves, sharpening vision to a degree that makes a Space Marine's unaided sight comparable to the best optical equipment available to Imperial forces. The lineman's ear, implanted into the inner ear, eliminates any possibility of being disoriented by sudden sound, gyroscopic disruption, or extreme rotational forces. The Space Marine cannot be disoriented by noise or motion. They can choose to become immune to sounds that would rupture a normal person's eardrums. The catalepsian node is a remarkable organ that sits in the brain and allows the warrior to enter a state of semi-conscious rest, in which one hemisphere of the brain sleeps while the other remains active and alert. A Space Marine does not need what you would recognize as sleep. They can maintain full cognitive function and physical readiness across extended periods that would reduce ordinary humans to hallucinating wrecks of exhaustion. The preamnor is a pre-stomach, a chemical processing organ that sits ahead of the main digestive system and neutralizes any toxins or pathogens in food before they reach the stomach proper. A Space Marine can eat almost anything and process it as nutrition. This is less of a battle advantage and more a reflection of the environment they're expected to operate in, where normal food supply chains do not exist, and the warrior must be prepared to sustain themselves on whatever is available. The omophagia is strange and slightly unsettling, even by the standards of this process. It is an organ that allows the Space Marine to absorb genetic memory through the consumption of tissue, literally eating flesh or drinking blood and receiving impressions of the memories encoded in that biological material. In practice, this means that a Space Marine who consumes the flesh of a creature or person may receive fragmented impressions of that being's memories, knowledge, and experiences. The practical utility of this in war is significant. The multi-lung gives the warrior an additional lung that can be sealed off from the rest of the respiratory system and activated in environments where the primary lungs would be overwhelmed, extremely high-altitude environments, toxic atmospheres, and situations where the warrior needs to operate with the breathable air supply entirely cut off. The Susan membrane can place the warrior into a state of complete suspended animation, a biological response to catastrophic injury that essentially pauses all bodily functions and preserves life until help arrives or conditions improve. A Space Marine who has been grievously wounded and would otherwise die can be stabilized in this state and revived by an apothecary later, sometimes days or even weeks after the injury occurred. The melanchromic organ controls skin pigmentation and adapts it to environmental radiation. A warrior who has been fighting for years under a star that emits different radiation than Terra will gradually have his skin color and texture modified to optimize his body's response to those conditions. This is why Space Marines from different chapters, recruited from different worlds across the galaxy, may look dramatically different from each other, despite coming from the same biological template. And finally, the Black Carapace. This is the last implant, the one that elevates a neophyte into a full initiate, and it is perhaps the most important of all. A layer of living black material that spreads across the warrior's subcutaneous tissue and grows to interface directly with power armor. When a Space Marine dons his armor, the Black Carapace creates a direct neural link between his nervous system and the suit, turning it into a second skin he can feel and control as naturally as his own body. He does not wear the armor so much as inhabit it. For the Black Templars specifically, there is one additional consideration in this process. The gene seed of Rogel Dorn is considered among the most stable in the Imperium. The Imperial Fists and their successors are known for reliable, consistent implantation results with minimal mutation or degradation. But there is one organ that is conspicuously absent from Black Templar physiology, or rather, conspicuously non-functional. The Black Templars do not field librarians, the sanctioned psychic warriors that most other chapters rely on. The exact historical reason for this is unclear even in the chapter's own records, though the most accepted explanation traces to the Edict of Nicaea, an ancient decree made by the Emperor himself, long before the Horus Heresy, that commanded Space Marine legions to halt the use of psychers in military roles. Most chapters quietly set this edict aside after the heresy demonstrated how much psychic capability mattered on the battlefield. The Black Templars, who treat the Emperor as a literal god and therefore treat his words as divine commandment, did not. To them, the decision to exclude librarians is not a tactical sacrifice. It is an act of obedience to their deity, carried out with the same completeness that defines everything else about how they operate. When a potential recruit is tested for psychic potential during the selection process and found to possess it, the outcome is usually that they are quietly rejected or redirected. What happens in cases where psychic ability manifests later, after the implantation process has already begun, is a matter of darker speculation. The Black Templars themselves do not discuss it. What you end up with, after all of these implantations, all of this surgery, all of this psychological conditioning and biological transformation, is something that stands approximately 2.5 meters tall, is encased in half a ton of ceramite power armor, possesses 2 hearts, multiple redundant organ systems, catalepsy and sleep capability, immunities to most things that would kill a normal person, strength that can overturn a vehicle, and the kind of reflexes that make an ordinary soldier's best day look like moving through mud. And then you give this thing a chainsword and a lifetime of warfare, and you point it at the enemies of mankind, and you say, never stop. That is the biological foundation of a Black Templar. Everything else is built on top of it. Section 3. The road to the keep, becoming a neophyte. The path to becoming a Black Templar does not begin in a recruiting hall with a handshake and a signature. It begins in the worst conditions that whatever world they are recruiting from can offer. Because the Black Templars have no homeworld, their recruitment process is fundamentally different from most other chapters. A chapter like the Space Wolves draws its warriors from Fenris, one specific world with one specific culture. The Salamanders recruit from Nocturne. But the Black Templars plant their chapter keeps on every world they conquer or liberate, and those keeps serve as permanent recruiting stations, maintained across generations by a small garrison of chapter serfs, and watched over by chaplains who keep a constant eye on the populations they've been placed among. These keeps are substantial structures. They can accommodate 2 to 3 fighting companies worth of space marines, and they are built in the image of the fortresses the Imperial Fists were famous for constructing, heavy, imposing, designed to withstand serious military assault. They are not warm places. They are not welcoming places. They are statements in stone and ceramite that the Imperium is here and will not be moved. The young men who aspire to join the chapter are called expectanten, and the path they must walk just to be considered for recruitment is itself a test that most of them will fail. The word means something close to those who wait in hope, which has a gentle sound that is completely at odds with what it actually involves. To declare your intention to join the Black Templars is to accept a journey that will likely kill you before it even reaches the point of formal evaluation. The aspirant must travel to the chapter keep, and in the context of whatever fractured, war-damaged, sometimes hostile world they live on, that journey alone can involve crossing hundreds of miles of dangerous terrain, fighting off bandits or predators or environmental hazards that would comfortably end a lesser life. This is not an accident. It is the first filter. If you cannot survive the road to the keep, you are never going to survive the road to becoming a space marine. Those who arrive are then evaluated by the chaplains, who watch without emotion and judge with standards that are not written down anywhere they'll show you. The contests they put aspirants through are rarely tests of intelligence or technical skill. They are tests of something rawer and harder to define. Tests of whether you will break, whether you will stop when the pain becomes more than you thought you could hold, whether your body has the capacity to become what it needs to become. The combat trials are exactly what you'd expect and worse than you're imagining. Young men thrown against each other in conditions that would make any reasonable authority institution shut down the whole program immediately, because reasonable authority institutions don't exist in the 41st millennium, and the Black Templars have zero interest in preserving the health of someone they're about to try to turn into a killing machine. The physical screening that follows goes into the body rather than around it. The chapter's apothecaries administer tissue compatibility tests that check whether the recruit's biology is capable of accepting the gene seed implants without catastrophic rejection. They screen for latent mutations, because a warrior whose gene seed expression produces unexpected deviations is a problem the chapter cannot and will not tolerate. They screen for everything that might compromise the eventual warrior's function. This testing is not comfortable. It is not designed to be. A significant number of aspirants die during this stage, not from negligence, not from cruelty for its own sake, but because the process of gene seed implantation is genuinely dangerous, and the human body is not designed to accommodate what's being done to it. The Black Templars do not apologize for these losses. They describe them as the Emperor's selection, the idea being that those who survive are the ones who were always meant to. The ones who pass become neophytes, and it is here that their relationship with the chapter truly begins, and here that the Black Templars diverge most dramatically from how other chapters handle their youngest warriors. In a codex-compliant chapter, a neophyte would be assigned to a scout company. He would train under veteran scouts, operate in relatively lower-risk reconnaissance roles, and gradually work his way toward full initiation as his physical transformation completed. He would be, for a time, set somewhat apart from the main fighting force. That is not how the Black Templars do it. Each neophyte is assigned directly to a fighting company and placed under the personal tutelage of a single initiate, a full battle brother who becomes his mentor, teacher, guardian, and, in many cases, the most important person in his life for the next several years. He enters the Crusader squad as an apprentice, learning not in a classroom but in actual combat alongside actual initiates, against actual enemies who are trying very hard to kill everyone present. The relationship between a neophyte and his supervising initiate is one of the most distinctive features of Black Templar culture, and one of the most demanding. Outside of battle, the neophyte's duties include caring for his initiate's arms and armor, a responsibility that is far more serious than it might sound. The weapons and armor of a space marine are irreplaceable, sacred objects that require constant maintenance and careful attention. Learning to care for them properly is in itself an education in what they are and what they mean. The neophyte waits upon his mentor during chapter feasts. He acts as his second in honor duels. He stands vigil through the long hours of prayer when his initiate is in meditation. The key understanding here is that this service is not a form of menial punishment. It is a genuine transfer of knowledge and tradition. The experience and wisdom of each generation of Black Templars is passed down not through formal lectures and curriculum, but through this lived relationship between a veteran and a new warrior. When the initiate fights, the neophyte watches and absorbs. When the initiate makes a decision, the neophyte learns how decisions are made. When the initiate prays, the neophyte learns what they are praying for and why. If the supervising initiate dies before the neophyte's training is complete, which happens with notable regularity in a chapter that fights as aggressively as the Black Templars, another initiate takes over the mentorship, but only if that initiate judges the neophyte worthy of the investment. A neophyte who finds himself without a mentor after his supervising initiate falls in battle has a very short window to prove himself valuable enough for someone else to take him on. This is, deliberately, a pressure that concentrates the mind wonderfully. The physical transformation continues across all of this time. The gene seed organs do not all arrive at once, and each implantation requires recovery time, adaptation, and in some cases is accompanied by significant pain as the body adjusts to what has been placed inside it. A neophyte may be in the middle of adapting to a new organ implantation and find himself deployed into live combat within days. The capacity to perform under conditions of active physical change is part of what is being tested. Those who make it through are elevated to the rank of initiate by the chapter's chaplains, who pronounce their assessment of the neophyte's courage, skill, and worthiness, with the apothecaries administering the final implantations, including the black carapace that seals the process. The warrior now has a set of his own power armor, properly fitted and interfacing with his newly complete biological systems. He is a Black Templar, and the crusade is his life, forever, until the day he dies in it. Section 4. The Life of an Initiate, War Without End. The moment a warrior becomes an initiate, he steps fully into the rhythm that will define the rest of his existence. And that rhythm has one dominant beat: war. Not war as an event that punctuates otherwise normal life. Not war as something that happens for a while, and then there is a period of recovery and return to some baseline. War as the permanent state of things, the environment in which every single day is spent, the air they breathe and the ground they stand on, whether they are firing weapons on a contested world or sitting in the chapel of a strike cruiser waiting for the next drop. When not in active combat operations, a Black Templar initiate fills his time in ways that would look, from the outside, like extremely dedicated preparation for the next time he will be in active combat. Long hours of prayer and meditation, not as a calming practice, but as a form of spiritual maintenance, as the regular charging of the faith that is as much a weapon as the bolter on his back. Exacting training rituals, covering everything from hand-to-hand combat to the tactical deployment of armored vehicles, to the proper liturgy for blessing a weapon before battle. Physical conditioning that pushes a body already operating at superhuman levels to its absolute limits, because even a Space Marine can always be harder, faster, more dangerous than he currently is. Those who are mentoring neophytes add to this an intensive demand on their time and attention. The relationship works both ways. Training a neophyte is not simply a responsibility to the chapter's future. It is also a discipline, a practice of articulating what you know and why you do things the way you do them, which deepens and clarifies your own understanding in ways that simply doing it never can. The initiate's spiritual life is, by design, inseparable from his martial one. The Black Templars have a deeply religious relationship with warfare, in a way that most other Space Marine chapters do not. Where a chapter like the Ultramarines approaches war as a technical and intellectual discipline, as something to be studied and refined and executed with precision, the Black Templars approach it as an act of worship. They are, in a very real sense, at prayer when they are fighting. The chainsword is the censer, the bolter is the incantation, the blood of enemies is the offering. This is not metaphor within the chapter's own understanding. They mean it literally. The Emperor is their god, not a particularly powerful human being, not the distant symbolic figure that most Space Marine chapters revere with a kind of professional respect. A god, divine, capable of granting visions and choosing champions, present in the outcome of battles that his warriors fight in his name. The faith of the Black Templars is not the same thing as the faith of the Adeptus Ministorum, the body that runs the imperial cult for most of humanity, but it burns with a heat that makes ordinary imperial religious observance look like a guttering candle. This faith has practical consequences in how the initiate moves through his day. Prayer is not a casual morning routine. It is a substantial commitment of time and focus, conducted under the watchful guidance of the chapter's chaplains, who serve not just as battle leaders, but as the custodians of the chapter's spiritual health. The purity seals that adorn Black Templar armor are not decorative. Each one represents a vow taken, a sin confessed and discharged, a spiritual debt paid. An initiate who has been fighting for decades may have dozens of them on his armor, each one a small wax seal attached to a strip of parchment with writing on it, pressed against the armor at the relevant location and left there until the chaplain declares the vow satisfied. The heraldry of a Black Templar initiate's armor tells a story. The black field speaks to the service they offer. Black as the armor of chaplains, black as a statement of direct devotion to the Emperor. The white cross on the shoulder speaks to the chapter's history and the crusading orders it draws its imagery from, a deliberate echo of the Knights Templar and Hospitallers of ancient Terra, translated into ceramite and plasma at the scale of the 41st millennium. The red accents are the color of blood and of sacrifice. The tabards and robes that many warriors wear over their armor give them the look of medieval crusaders in powdered plate, which is precisely the aesthetic the chapter intends. In battle, the Black Templar initiate is positioned at the absolute sharpest end of close-quarters warfare. The chapter's tactical philosophy is not complicated and does not try to be. The entire concept is to close the distance between the warrior and the enemy as quickly as physically possible, and then engage in a style of combat so personally brutal and so immediately overwhelming that the enemy simply cannot cope with it. Ranged weapons are used to suppress and to keep enemy heads down during the advance, not to win engagements from a comfortable distance. Vehicles, particularly the Land Raider Crusader, a variant that the Black Templars themselves pioneered and first deployed, are used as mobile delivery systems to carry warriors into the heart of enemy positions where they can dismount and fight. The Land Raider Crusader deserves particular mention here because it perfectly encapsulates the tactical philosophy of the chapter. Where the standard Land Raider carries las cannons, heavy weapons, designed for destroying vehicles and fortifications at range, the Crusader variant replaces these with hurricane-pattern bolters, weapons far better suited to cutting down infantry in dense formations. The Crusader also carries a larger troop complement, meaning it can deliver more warriors to the point of contact than its predecessor. The entire modification says, we are not interested in fighting at long range. We want to be in the middle of this. The charge is sacred. It is the moment the warrior has been preparing for through all the prayer and all the training and all the vigils and all the fasting. The moment when the distance closes to nothing and there is nothing between the Black Templar and whatever is trying to kill him except a chainsword that is already screaming. In those seconds, something happens to the initiate that is difficult to describe without using the word transcendence. The faith that has been building all through the long hours of waiting and prayer releases itself all at once, expressed through the body rather than the voice, through action rather than words. This is what they believe fighting is for. This is what the Emperor wants from them. The expectation of casualties and their handling is something that marks another distinction between the Black Templars and more strategically cautious chapters. A Black Templar initiate expects to be wounded. He expects to see his battle brothers fall. The apothecaries who travel with each fighting company have a primary responsibility that goes beyond treating wounds. They are there to harvest the gene seed from the bodies of the fallen, recovering those precious genetic materials so that they can be used to create the next generation of warriors. The fallen do not go unmourned, but they are not supposed to be a reason to stop. They are a reason to push harder. What happens to an initiate who survives long enough to accumulate exceptional deeds? The chapter does not have an automatic promotion system the way Codex-compliant chapters do. An initiate may spend decades, even centuries in his rank, walking his own path, as the Black Templars themselves put it, because only the Emperor and the warrior himself can determine how his gifts should be wielded. As years pass, most initiates naturally develop specializations. Some become assault specialists. Some gravitate toward the operation of vehicles or the piloting of Invictor warsuits. Others take on sniper roles or serve in incursor teams that penetrate deep into enemy lines before the main attack. All of these are paths an initiate can walk without formal promotion, simply by demonstrating skill and commitment in a particular direction. After victories of exceptional difficulty or trials of particular significance, initiates receive battle honors, relics, and awards that are recorded in the chapter's histories and worn on the warrior's person as tangible markers of what has been endured and achieved. These honors are taken seriously in a way that goes beyond ceremony. They are documentation of the warrior's contribution to the eternal crusade, evidence that he is fulfilling the oath Sigismund swore, that the chapter's loyalty to the Emperor is being proven in blood on battlefields across the galaxy. And through all of it, the crusade moves on. The fleet travels. New enemies are found. New worlds are saved or burned, depending on whether their populations welcome the Emperor's truth or reject it. And the initiate fights, and prays, and trains, and waits for the order to drop, and fights again. World without end. Section 5. The faith that fuels the crusade religion, psychers, and the four vows. There is a specific way that many other Space Marine chapters look at the Black Templars when they encounter them. And it is the look you might give someone who is clearly very good at their job and also clearly slightly terrifying to be around. Because the faith of the Black Templars is not like anything else in the Adeptus Astartes. It is not the measured respect and professional dedication of the Ultramarines. It is not the primal spirituality of the Space Wolves. It is not the blood-soaked theology of the Blood Angels or the secretive mysticism of the Dark Angels. It is a burning, white-hot, genuinely and completely sincere religious conviction that the Emperor of mankind is God, that his warriors are his chosen instruments, that war fought in his name is a form of devotion, and that any deviation from his divine will is not just incorrect, but actively offensive to the sacred order of things. This matters enormously when you're trying to understand why a Black Templar behaves the way he does, because you cannot separate the warrior from the worshipper. They are the same person. Every choice the warrior makes in the field has a theological dimension. Every enemy that falls is a heretic or a xenos, or a mutant, being removed from a universe that the Emperor is trying to perfect. Every wound the warrior takes is a test of faith and a form of offering. Every battle won is evidence that the Emperor's divine favor rests upon his crusaders. The theology has built into it a specific emotional register. The Black Templars do not experience anger the way other people do. They experience wrath, which is different in the sense that it does not dissipate through satisfaction. Wrath fuels itself. Wrath at the enemies of the Emperor is a renewable resource, replenished through prayer, and maintained through the constant presence of the chaplains who remind the warriors of what they are fighting for and why the fight must never end. The chaplains of the Black Templars are more prominent figures in the daily life of the chapter than they are in many other chapters, precisely because the spiritual dimension of service is so central to the Black Templars. Identity. A chaplain in a codex-compliant chapter leads prayers and maintains morale and provides the ceremonial framework of chapter observance. A chaplain in the Black Templars does all of this and also serves as the primary interpreter of what the Emperor's will actually requires in any given situation. The voice of divine intention in the middle of a firefight, the presence that turns a desperate last stand from a military defeat into a sacred martyrdom. The hatred for psychers flows directly from the faith. The Emperor, at a gathering known as the Council of Nicaea, held long before the Horus Heresy, commanded his Space Marine legions to cease the military use of psychers. He saw the dangers clearly, the way that psychic power creates openings in the fabric of reality through which the entities of the warp can enter, the way that even a trained and sanctioned psyker is a potential vulnerability in the spiritual defenses of a host. The legions mostly complied for a while, and then gradually stopped complying as the wars of the Horus Heresy demonstrated how much psychic capability could contribute to military effectiveness. The Black Templars never resumed compliance because they never stopped it. The Emperor said no. To the Black Templars, that is the end of the discussion. It is not subject to practical reassessment or tactical rebalancing. It is a commandment from God, and they will follow it as long as the chapter exists. The result is that the Black Templars field no librarians, no sanctioned psyker warriors in their ranks. They have navigators aboard their ships, the rare human mutants who can perceive the light of the Astronomicon and guide vessels safely through the warp. They have astropaths, psychic communicators who can send messages across vast distances. These they tolerate, even revere, because they see them as servants whose gifts exist specifically to support the Emperor's servants in practical ways that do not involve fighting with warp energy. The astropath, who sends a distress call, is not a weapon. The navigator who keeps the fleet on course through the Imperium is not a warrior. These distinctions matter to the Black Templars in ways that would seem like hair-splitting to anyone outside the chapter, but feel completely coherent from within their theological framework. What does replace psychic support on the battlefield? Faith and the 4 vows. On the eve of significant battles, when the warriors have gathered and the candles are burning and the incense is thick in the air of the chapel deck, the Emperor's champion leads the assembled fighting company in the renewal of one of 4 sacred vows. These vows are not simple affirmations. They are battle oaths, spiritually binding commitments that reshape how the warrior approaches the coming engagement, amplifying certain aspects of his fury and dedication in ways that have been documented to have measurable effects on combat performance. The first vow is suffer, not the unclean to live. This one focuses the warrior's fury on the most immediate threat before him, cutting through the tactical complexity of a battlefield and sharpening the fighter's instincts down to a single imperative. There are enemies here. They must die. Nothing else matters. In practical terms, it makes the warrior more willing to take personal risks, to press the attack, to accept incoming fire without slowing, to throw himself into the close engagement without the hesitation that self-preservation instinct might otherwise introduce. The second vow is uphold the honor of the Emperor. Where the first vow is about destruction, this one is about endurance. The warrior who has taken this vow fights to hold, to refuse to yield ground, to maintain his position and his objective against whatever pressure is applied to dislodge him. This is the vow for defensive engagements, for holding strategic points, for standing your ground when the sensible thing would be to fall back and the honorable thing is to die before you do. The third vow is abhor the witch, destroy the witch. This one channels the chapter's specific hatred of psychers and warp-touched entities into a battlefield doctrine, sharpening the warrior's focus and capability against any enemy that draws on psychic power. Against enemy psychers, against demons, against forces corrupted by chaos, this vow makes the Black Templar something particularly dangerous, his faith acting as a kind of spiritual armor against the warp's influence, while his physical capability is directed with specific intensity at whatever warp-affiliated threat presents itself. The fourth vow is accept any challenge, no matter the odds. This is the most personally aggressive of the four, the one that most directly echoes the tradition of Sigismund and the Emperor's champion role. It commits the warrior to personal combat with the most significant enemies he can find, to not hanging back, to not allowing a rival champion or a supremely dangerous foe to operate unmolested while lesser enemies are dealt with. It says, "I will go to the hardest fight. I will find the most dangerous thing on this battlefield, and I will put myself in front of it." Each vow creates a different battlefield personality in the fighting company that swears it. The chaplain's job is to read the situation they're going into, understand what the engagement is likely to require, and lead the warriors in the vow that best prepares them for it. This is not a passive ritual process. It is an act of tactical judgment wrapped in the language of faith. The way that non-Black Templar warriors sometimes experience this from the outside is worth noting, because it touches on one of the things that makes the chapter somewhat uncomfortable to fight alongside. The Black Templars' attitude toward their own psyker-hating doctrine means that when they serve in joint operations with chapters that do field librarians, there is a sustained tension that never fully resolves. A Black Templar will serve alongside a chapter that has librarians if duty demands it, because serving the Emperor's cause takes precedence, but he will not be comfortable. He will fast and pray extensively to maintain spiritual purity in the vicinity of warp-active allies. He will tolerate, but the toleration costs him something real in the spiritual accounting that he runs constantly in his head. This makes the Black Templars somewhat isolated within the broader Adeptus Astartes, not hostile, not treasonous, but genuinely alien in their priorities, in a way that even other Space Marines find difficult to fully share. The chapter acknowledges this and considers it confirmation of their unique relationship with the God Emperor. If the truth they hold requires them to stand slightly apart, then they stand apart. Standing apart from those who do not share your level of devotion is not a problem. It is evidence that your devotion is real. Section 6. The Sword Brethren and the Emperor's Champion. Within a crusade fleet, the Black Templars operate a hierarchy that is organic rather than structural, in the way a Codex chapter's promotion system is structural. An initiate does not pass through a series of defined ranks on his way to veteran status. Instead, he builds a legend. He accumulates deeds, and eventually, if those deeds are significant enough, the marshal whose household the fighting company belongs to will recognize him and extend an invitation. That invitation is to the Sword Brethren. The Sword Brethren are the elite of the chapter, equivalent in function to a Codex chapter's first company, the veterans of veterans who serve in the marshal's personal household as his most trusted and most dangerous warriors. They wear the finest armor that the chapter's tech marines and artificers can produce or maintain, and they are heavily adorned with purity seals and crusade honors, visible records of careers that have spanned decades or centuries of continuous warfare. Every Black Templar's private ambition leads here, not to a captain's rank, not to command of a company, to the Sword Brethren, because in the Black Templar understanding, that is what a warrior's life earns. Not an administrative position, not responsibility for managing supply chains or coordinating logistics. Membership in the finest brotherhood of killers the chapter can produce, the group from which new marshals will eventually be chosen when combat rituals determine who among them will lead the next crusade. The determination of who becomes marshal when a previous marshal falls is itself one of the most Black Templar things about the Black Templars. When a marshal dies, and marshals die because marshals fight at the front, the Sword Brethren hold a ritual combat among themselves to determine who among them will rise to command. Not a debate, not a vote, not an evaluation by committee. A fight. Because in a culture that understands combat as the purest expression of worth, this is the only selection method that makes complete sense. The right to wear Terminator armor within the chapter is restricted exclusively to the Sword Brethren, another marker of their elite status. The massive, ancient suits of tactical dreadnought armor that other chapters distribute among their veteran companies are here a privilege reserved for those who have been recognized as among the finest warriors the chapter has ever produced. Wearing it means you have earned it, and you have earned it in the specific way Black Templars recognize earning, which is by being very good at violence, conducted in the name of the God Emperor. But above even the Sword Brethren in terms of the chapter's spiritual imagination is a role that is not permanent, not structural, and not earned through accumulated deeds in the conventional sense. It appears without warning. It is granted by the Emperor himself, if the Black Templar's own understanding is to be credited. This is the Emperor's champion. The tradition traces back to Sigismund, the first captain who stood at the walls of the imperial palace and challenged the champions of chaos to single combat and defeated them one after another until the siege was broken. What Sigismund did was a template, a demonstration of what it looks like when the Emperor's favor rests upon a warrior and directs him toward the most significant threats on the battlefield. In the Black Templars, this tradition continues through a ritual that happens on the eve of important battles. The warriors gather in the ship's chapel or in whatever sacred space the crusade has designated, and they kneel in prayer under the instruction of the chaplains. The candles are burned down, the air fills with the smell of incense, the liturgy goes on for hours, and then, sometimes, it ends differently than it always has before. During those long vigil hours, a single battle brother receives a vision. The accounts of what the visions contain vary from warrior to warrior, but certain elements recur. A pale and blazing knight fighting against an endless tide of enemies. A shining sword raised in challenge. The sense of being selected, pulled out from among the assembled brothers by something vast and certain that does not explain itself, but makes its choice clear. The warrior who receives the vision comes forward. He presents himself to the chaplains and confesses what he has seen. The chaplains examine him and determine whether the vision is genuine, whether this warrior has truly been called. In every generation of Black Templars, a handful of times each standard century, the chaplains confirm the selection, and what follows is a ceremony that strips the warrior of his previous identity. He is led to a contemplation chamber, away from his brothers. He removes his own weapons and armor, the gear that has accumulated years or decades of personal meaning and battle history. In their place, he is given the armor of faith, a suit of power armor sacred to the chapter and kept maintained for exactly this purpose, and one of the chapter's 10 sacred black swords, the Black Sword. The first of these was the weapon Sigismund carried, a paragon blade of lusterless black metal that can cut through stone and ceramite without being marred. The current chapter holds 10 such blades, each one precious beyond calculation, each one the inheritance of every Emperor's champion who has ever walked onto a battlefield carrying it. The warrior who becomes the Emperor's champion leaves his rank behind. Whether he was a raw initiate or a veteran of the Sword Brethren, the moment he is anointed, that identity disappears. He is now and only the Emperor's champion, and his single duty is the fulfillment of his vision. He seeks out the most dangerous and significant enemy on the battlefield. He challenges them. He fights them in personal combat, or pushes through the press to reach them if they won't meet him directly. And he does not stop until the task is complete, or until the black sword is pried from his dead hands. The champion does not concede, not ever. Not to injury, not to exhaustion, not to odds that are objectively insane. The Emperor chose him. The Emperor guides him. His golden light, according to the tradition, burns brightest around the mightiest enemies, directing the champion's steps even when the fog of battle would otherwise obscure what needs to be done. When the champion falls, which happens, because even the Emperor's chosen are mortal and their enemies are not always kind about it, it is considered a significant ill omen for the battle to come. The chapter records the champion's name and deeds, regardless of the outcome. When the champion survives and the vision is fulfilled, the chaplain discharges duty and he returns to his previous identity and rank, though now carrying the weight of the experience with him. The black swords are retrieved at essentially any cost. If a champion falls in battle and his sword is left on the field, the chapter has been known to launch entire crusades to recover the relic. Not because the war for the sword is guaranteed to be won, but because the sword must be recovered. Its loss to the hands of enemies is simply not an acceptable state of affairs. This willingness to expend significant force and suffer significant losses for the sake of a relic reflects a broader attitude toward material objects within the chapter that is worth noting. The Black Templars do not have the same detachment from things that you might expect of warriors who describe themselves as living for a spiritual cause. Their relics are not just inspiring symbols. They are genuine connections to the moments that made the chapter what it is, to Sigismund, to the warriors who came before, to the long chain of sacrifice and devotion that the current crusade is the latest expression of. Losing a relic is not just losing an object, it is losing a piece of the story. The Sword Brethren understand this, which is why the recovery of relics often falls to them, not as a mercy mission or a side errand while the main battle proceeds, but as a primary objective in itself. Section 7. Home aboard a warship life in the Crusade fleet. Most Space Marine chapters have a home world, a planet that grounds them, provides their recruits, anchors their history and physical geography. When a warrior of the Ultramarines thinks of home, he thinks of Macragge. When a Space Wolf remembers where he came from, he thinks of Fenris. When a Black Templar thinks of home, he thinks of a ship. The Crusade fleets of the Black Templars are the chapter's entire existence between battles, and between battles is something of an optimistic framing, because the chapter makes a deliberate practice of ensuring that there is never very much distance between the current engagement and the next one. Still, the fleet is where they live, and understanding what that actually looks like explains a great deal about how Black Templars think about the world they inhabit. A Crusade fleet is not a single vessel. It is a collection of warships, typically anchored around at least one battle barge, a massive capital vessel that serves as the command and coordination center of the Crusade, flanked by strike cruisers that carry fighting companies and provide tactical flexibility, training vessels where neophytes continue their development during transit, and forge ships where the chapter's tech marines maintain and manufacture the weapons, armor, and vehicles that keep the Crusade operational. Life on these ships does not stop. The warriors do not go on leave. There is no shore leave for a Black Templar in the conventional sense, because there is no shore. There are worlds they pass through, worlds they fight on, worlds they liberate or punish, depending on what they find when they arrive. But after the fighting is done, they get back on the fleet and the fleet moves on. The concept of home, in the way most humans understand it, does not map onto the Black Templar experience. What the ship provides instead is community and continuity. The relationship between a warrior and his fighting company, built through shared combat and shared prayer and the intimate daily contact of life aboard a warship, is the closest thing to a family that most Black Templars will ever know. The bonds formed in a Crusader squad across decades of warfare are not casual. They are the most important relationships in most warriors' lives, more important than any connection to a place, more important than any association with a geographic identity. The chapel is the heart of the warship in a way that the equivalent sacred spaces of other chapters are not. In a Black Templar ship, the chapel is where the most important things happen, not the bridge, not the armory, though both of those are vital. The chapel is where the warriors become what they are each day, renewed in their purpose, reminded of their identity, spiritually maintained against the erosion of despair that a life of constant warfare without rest or reprieve could easily produce. The chaplains who lead these services have an enormous amount of power over the culture of the fleet they serve, which is why their selection is taken seriously and their authority respected without question. A chaplain who can make the warriors feel the Emperor's presence in the worst moments of a battle is more valuable than any weapons upgrade. The Eternal Crusader deserves special attention because it is not simply the High Marshal's flagship. It is the soul of the entire chapter, the vessel that contains the most sacred relics, the original chamber where the chapter was formally recognized as such by the Primarch Rogel Dorn, and the spiritual home of every Black Templar anywhere in the galaxy, regardless of which crusade they currently serve with. The ship has been expanded and refitted so many times across 10,000 years that its original architecture is almost completely buried under centuries of modification. It is a Gloriana-class battleship, one of the ancient and enormous vessels designed for the Great Crusade itself, and it currently holds twice the standard complement of a normal battle barge, which gives you a sense of the scale of what the High Marshal travels with. Somewhere within the Eternal Crusader, there is a place called the Chamber of the First Proclamation, also called Sigismund's Hall, where Rogal Dorn formally recognized the Black Templars as an independent chapter. And somewhere else, there is the Scriptorum of Truths, which stands in place of the Librarius that other chapters maintain. The Scriptorum is a vast archive of tomes and scrolls documenting the chapter's history and the Imperial Creed, a library of everything the chapter knows and believes. It is said the archive is so extensive that a single person reading continuously would not reach the end in a normal human lifetime. Notably, the Scriptorum has been periodically purged across the millennia. Ancient truths that were judged to have become theologically problematic were burned, their information removed from the accessible record. This is a somewhat dark fact about the chapter that does not receive as much attention as it might. A chapter that regularly removes information from its own historical record is a chapter actively shaping its own memory, choosing what its past will look like from the inside, looking back. Whether this is a neutral archival practice or something more troubling is left as an exercise for the reader. The daily rhythm of life on the fleet involves substantial blocks of time dedicated to both physical and spiritual maintenance. Warriors clean and check their weapons not just as preparation for battle, but as a meditative practice. The physical care of the instruments of the Emperor's will understood as a form of prayer in itself. They spar continuously, maintaining and developing skills that will atrophy without constant practice. They conduct honor duels when disagreements require resolution, because the Black Templar method of resolving serious disputes between warriors involves one of the few circumstances where two members of the same chapter point weapons at each other with serious intent. When a crusade arrives at a new world, there is a period of assessment before deployment. The chaplains study what is known about the enemy and the terrain. The marshal confers with his castellans. The Emperor's champion, if one has been selected for this engagement, prepares himself in the contemplation chamber. The warriors renew their vow, and then the drop pods fall. Section 8. The man who built the Eternal Crusade Sigismund. There are figures in Warhammer 40,000 whose importance is easy to describe because it is contained within a finite set of events. And then there is Sigismund, whose importance is harder to describe because everything the Black Templars are traces back to him in a way that makes him less a historical figure and more the ongoing defining presence of the entire chapter. Sigismund was born on Terra, in the drift camps of the Ionis Plateau, which tells you immediately that his origins were not comfortable. He rose to become the first captain of the Imperial Fists during the Great Crusade, second in authority only to Rogal Dorn himself, which tells you that his rise was not casual either. This was a man who reached the highest position available to him in the most demanding environment that existed, at a time when the entire galaxy was being brought to heel by the greatest military force in human history. His personality, as it comes through in the scattered records of the age, was interesting for a first captain of a legion. He was possessed of something that his contemporaries described as a prophet's quality, a sense of seeing further than the present moment, of understanding things that others were still catching up to. While the Great Crusade was in full momentum, and most Legion officers were swept up in the magnificent project of reuniting humanity under the Emperor's banner, Sigismund stated plainly in conversations recorded from the era that the Great Crusade would never truly end, that humanity's enemies were too many and too persistent for a final victory to be achievable, that the work would go on forever. People at the time thought this was a dark view from a warrior who perhaps took the weight of his responsibility too seriously. In hindsight, we know Sigismund was simply correct, and correct with a clarity that no one else at the table had managed to reach yet. When the Horus heresy broke, Sigismund's role was immediate and defining. Rogal Dorn chose him as the Emperor's champion, the warrior who would stand at the walls of the Imperial Palace and meet the champions of chaos in single combat, one after another, for the duration of the siege. He was given the best armor the Legion could provide and a blade of lusterless black metal that would eventually become the template for the black swords that the chapter still carries. He fought more than 24 champions of chaos in single combat during the siege, and he won every fight, not against equals or near equals. Against chaos-empowered champions, warriors enhanced by the direct gifts of the warp gods, beings that had been killing space marines for years before they walked out to face Sigismund. He defeated them all, one at a time, with a consistency that his contemporaries described with a word they did not use casually: miraculous. After the heresy, in the political chaos of the Second Founding, when Rogaldorn's refusal to accept the Codex Astartes had brought the imperial fists to the edge of being declared heretics by the very Imperium they had just bled to save, Sigismund made his choice. He gathered the most zealous of his brothers, the warriors who shared his particular fire, and he made a promise. The promised crusade would prove the chapter's loyalty. The chapter would never rest. The campaign would not end with a campaign. It would end only when there were no more enemies to fight, which Sigismund knew perfectly well would never happen. He was not promising a finite thing. He was declaring an infinite one. He took his warriors into space. He took the black and white of his personal heraldry and made it the chapter's. He took the black cross of the Imperial Fist's veterans and made it the chapter's symbol. And he set course for the Cadian Gate, the choke point through which anyone emerging from the Eye of Terror would have to pass, because Sigismund had not stopped watching the shadows where the traitor legions had fled. Everyone who could hear him told him he was waiting for something that would not happen, that the traitors were gone, that the Eye of Terror was a permanent quarantine that would keep them contained. Sigismund waited anyway. Centuries passed. The chapter crusaded, because crusading was the oath, and the oath was everything. But Sigismund never stopped watching the Cadian Gate. He was 1,000 years old when he was finally proven right. Think about that for a moment. 1,000 years old, the warp's effect on time inside the Eye of Terror had preserved Abaddon and his warriors as if the centuries had been mere weeks for them. For Sigismund, those same centuries had been lived in full, every year of them, a millennium of continuous service. All of his organic tissue sustained against time by the biology that made him a space marine, but aging in ways that only a being of his constitution could even survive. He was old. He was still himself, still Sigismund, still burning with the faith and the purpose that had defined him since before the Siege of Terra. But 1,000 years of wearing anybody down had left marks that no amount of faith could completely undo. Abaddon the Despoiler came out of the Eye of Terror at the head of the newly named Black Legion, the first of his 13 Black Crusades, and the Black Templars were waiting. What followed was a void battle, and then something that passed into legend immediately. Abaddon boarded the Eternal Crusader with his warriors, driving towards Sigismund through scores of defenders who died trying to stop him. When they finally stood in the same chamber, Abaddon did something unexpected. He stopped. He spoke. He offered, with what sounds like genuine respect in the accounts, an impassioned argument that Sigismund and his warriors were wasting their service on an emperor who could no longer receive it, that the Space Marine legions had built the Imperium and deserved to rule it rather than be subordinate to the dead weight of the High Lords of Terra. Sigismund told him he was wrong. Abaddon had wielded the talon of Horus, the claw that had wounded the emperor himself and killed the Primarch Sanguinius. He had been preserved by the warp, while Sigismund had spent 1,000 years in real space. By any physical assessment, Abaddon should have won the duel easily. It was not easy. Sigismund fought with everything he had, and what he had was a lifetime of experience that made Abaddon, for all his warp-fueled power, work harder than he'd expected. In a last desperate attempt to end the fight and take Abaddon down with him, Sigismund threw himself forward and drove the black sword into Abaddon's chest. It was not enough. Abaddon used the talon. Sigismund fell. What Abaddon did next is one of those details that reveals something true about character. He did not desecrate the body. He had it returned to the Imperium, along with Sigismund's black sword. On the blade, he had carved 3 words: "We are returned." The death of Sigismund could have broken the chapter. The founder, the architect of everything they were, gone before they had reached even 1,000 years of the crusade he had promised would be eternal. Instead, it did the opposite. Every High Marshal since has renewed Sigismund's oath at the moment of their investiture. Every one of them has understood their role as the continuation of something their founder began, and their death will not end. The scar Abaddon received from Sigismund's final strike was permanent. Even after 10,000 years of Black Crusades, the Lord of the Black Legion carries that mark. In every subsequent Black Crusade, across every conflict that followed, Sigismund's last thrust landed in some sense over and over. The wound that cannot be healed, from the warrior who would not stop trying. That is the man the Black Templars are trying to be. Not a copy of him, not a museum piece that simply preserves his image. The actual continuation of his purpose, carried forward in different bodies across different centuries, but always pointing in the same direction. The proof of loyalty was never supposed to be finished. Section 9. Grimaldus and the Hell of Hell's Reach. If Sigismund is the deep foundation of what the Black Templars are, Chaplain Merritt Grimaldus, the High Chaplain known as the Hero of Hell's Reach, is perhaps the clearest window into what their values look like in the most extreme possible conditions. The story of Hell's Reach is a story about what happens when 100 warriors are asked to hold a position that would require 100,000 to hold comfortably, when they refuse to retreat, and when ultimately only one of them walks out from the rubble. 1. Before we get to Hell's Reach, it is worth understanding who Grimaldus was before that battle, because he was already remarkable. He held the distinction of being the youngest sword brother in the chapter's history at the time of his appointment, which tells you something immediate about the pace and intensity of his rise. He served under the reclusiarch Mordred, the senior chaplain of a crusade, absorbing the traditions and spiritual practices of the chapter's most demanding pastoral role, while simultaneously being one of its most effective fighters. His first command as reclusiarch came in circumstances that would have made most commanders quietly request someone else take it. The Third War for Armageddon in 998. M41 was one of the largest military engagements the Imperium had faced in recent history. The Orc warlord Ghazghkull Mag, Uruk Thraka, had returned to Armageddon with a force so enormous that the planet's orbital defenses were overwhelmed before the ground war even started. High Marshal Helbrecht dispatched 3 Black Templar crusades to Armageddon, deploying a total of approximately 900 Space Marines to a planet of billions that was being overrun by what conservative estimates placed at tens of millions of Orc fighters. Helbrecht himself commanded the space fleet, conducting void engagements against Orc ships to prevent reinforcements reaching the surface. Grimaldus was given command of 100 of those 900 Marines and assigned to the defense of Hive Hell's Reach, not the most prestigious posting, not the primary front where the glory would be won. A hive city, one of many on the planet, under siege from Orc forces that had emerged from the Deadlands to the south and were swarming the city's walls in formations so dense they changed the color of the ground. He was not delighted about this assignment. He saw it as something less than what his capabilities and his new rank warranted. He went anyway, because that is what you do when the High Marshal gives you an order. When he arrived at Hell's Reach, what he found was a city already under enormous pressure. The Armageddon Steel Legion, the planet's highly capable and experienced guard regiments, held sections of the wall alongside the Black Templars, and a small but fierce contingent of Sisters of Battle. 19 Titans of the Legio Invigilata, the enormous walking god engines that represented perhaps the most powerful conventional weapons available to the Imperium, added their fire to the defense. For months, the battle raged with an intensity that ground everything it touched to nothing. The walls were breached, districts fell. The population died in their millions as the Orcs pushed into the city block by block, systematically dismantling everything that had been built there. The Imperial Guard units held their assigned positions until the dead were stacked in front of their emplacements and then held a little longer. The Black Templars, under Grimaldus, did what Black Templars do. They did not hold positions. They counterattacked. They drove the Orcs back from ground that had been lost, reclaiming streets and intersections and hab blocks through a sustained ferocity that made the Orcs' own savage aggression look measured by comparison. They took casualties throughout. 100 became 90, then 80, then 60. The crisis point came when the Legio Invigilata's commitment to the defense wavered after the loss of their Princeps Maximus. The Titans began withdrawing, their new commander judging that continued losses to the god engines were too high a price for a secondary theater of what was already a planet-wide disaster. Without the Titans, the remaining forces in Hell's Reach could not hold the outer walls. Grimaldus made a choice. He consolidated the remaining Black Templars, approximately 35 warriors at that point, at the Temple of the Emperor Ascendant. This was the oldest place of worship in Hell's Reach, a basilica constructed by the planet's original colonists, housing relics from the city's founding that predated the current conflict by centuries. As a place of sacred importance and a defensible structure, it was the right ground for a last stand. The words he reportedly spoke became his most famous, quoted in the chapter's records and in any account of the battle that has been produced since. "I have dug my grave in this place, and I will either triumph or I will die." Not a particularly complex sentiment, not theologically sophisticated, just a declaration of the most basic Black Templar value stated in the plainest possible terms. He was not moving. He was not calculating whether the odds made it rational to stay. He had chosen a piece of ground, and the only way he was leaving it was either victorious or dead. The orcs came in wave after wave. The Imperial Guard units that had been supporting the temple fell back or died. The Sisters of Battle who had been fighting alongside the Templars were reduced to nothing. The 35 Black Templars fought through the night and into the next day, and through that day and into the next night, until the temple itself was on fire around them and the enemy was pressing through the walls. The temple collapsed. All were thought lost. A day later, Grimaldus crawled out of the rubble. Just Grimaldus, the sole survivor, carrying in his arms the last intact relics from the temple of the Emperor Ascendant, rescued from the ruins during whatever impossible final hours he had spent buried under thousands of tons of burning stone. The apothecaries who treated him afterward said they could not account for the fact that he was alive. They could not document any biological mechanism that explained how a body that had taken the damage his had taken could have continued functioning long enough to do what he had done. The wounds should have been fatal. Not should have been slowed him down fatal. Should have been fatal, in the way that medicine uses the word to mean this person is now dead. The Black Templars called it a miracle. Given that their faith in the God Emperor's ability to sustain his chosen warriors is literally sincerely held, this was not a metaphorical description. The population of Hell's Reach gave him the title Hero of Hell's Reach, the greatest honor they could bestow. He carried the relics he had recovered from the temple into every subsequent battle, attached to Cenobite servitors who accompanied him onto the field, making his presence on a battlefield immediately recognizable because of the hovering, shuffling train of sacred objects behind him. What makes the story of Hell's Reach more than just a tale of survival, impressive as that survival is what it demonstrates about the Black Templar relationship to duty. Grimaldus was not stationed at Hell's Reach because it was a prestigious post. He was not defending the temple of the Emperor Ascendant because it offered tactical advantage. He was there because an order had placed him there, because the temple was a sacred site, because the Emperor's soldiers do not abandon sacred sites, no matter what the military calculus says about the wisdom of staying, and because the Black Templars' most fundamental article of faith holds that yielding ground to the Emperor's enemies is not an option when you still have the capacity to contest it. He had the capacity, therefore he contested it. The 100 became one, and the one crawled out of the rubble with sacred relics in his arms and reported for the next duty he was given. That is, in a very concentrated form, what it means to be a Black Templar. Section 10. High Marshal Helbrecht, the Living Crusade. While Sigismund is the chapter's ancestor, and Grimaldus its most vivid example of individual devotion, the figure who represents the Black Templars in the current era of the 41st and 42nd millennia is High Marshal Helbrecht, a warrior whose career reads like a catalog of impossible situations approached without visible hesitation. Helbrecht grew up in the chapter the way Black Templars do, through combat. As a neophyte, he is documented fighting alongside the legendary High Marshal Ludaldus during the Vinculus Crusade, absorbing leadership from a figure who was already the stuff of chapter legend. When the Crusade's Marshal Dedan was killed in action, Helbrecht stepped up to take command, not because he was next in any administrative sequence, but because he was the best available, and the situation demanded someone take the job immediately. His rise through the chapter followed the same pattern, not steady institutional promotion. A series of defining moments where Helbrecht was the person in the right place with the right combination of skill and will to handle what was happening. The most famous of his pre-High Marshal moments was on Cephian IV, where he slew a warp-spawned vampire that had risen to power and was controlling a hive world like a puppet master pulling strings from the shadows. This was the act that earned him a place in the Sword Brethren. He became High Marshal in 989, M41 after the death of Marshal Cordhel, at the hands of a Chaos champion, elected unanimously by the marshals of the various crusades. Unanimously. In a chapter where selection involves combat and competition is the baseline culture, unanimous agreement on any question is remarkable. His first act was to accept the sword of the High Marshals, the ceremonial weapon that has passed through every High Marshal's hands since the chapter's founding, and launch a crusade against the Scythor fiends in the Ghoul Stars. The Ghoul Stars are one of those regions of the galaxy where no expedition has ever returned feeling good about what it found out there. Helbrecht took the crusade anyway, because the threat was real, and because he had just been given command of the most aggressive military force in the Imperium, and the obvious thing to do was find something that needed killing. The encounter with the Necron Pharaon Imhotep the Stormlord represents one of the more personally important episodes in Helbrecht's biography because it demonstrates something true about the High Marshal as a person. He is not invincible, and he knows it, and this does not appear to concern him as much as you might expect. In an earlier engagement, Imhotep had taken Helbrecht's hand, not metaphorically. The Necron Pharaon physically removed the High Marshal's hand in combat and kept it as a trophy, which is exactly the kind of calculated insult that a being who has been awake and accumulating grudges since before mankind built its first city would think of as an appropriately elegant statement. Helbrecht's response was to conduct a 5-year crusade of penitence, which in Black Templar terms means 5 years of warfare deliberately accepted as an act of spiritual reckoning, an acknowledgement that the failure was real and must be addressed through sacrifice and renewed commitment. Then he made a pilgrimage to the Phalanx, the great fortress ship of the Imperial Fists, to pray at the preserved hand of Rogel Dorn himself. What he reportedly found in that prayer was the realization that losing his hand was not simply a defeat. It was a symbol. Rogel Dorn had sacrificed himself entirely. Helbrecht had sacrificed a hand. This was not a tragedy. This was the Emperor's reminder of what service actually costs. His faith renewed, Helbrecht went after Imhotep again. He boarded the Necron tomb ship Inevitable Conqueror with his warriors, fought his way to the Pharaon's presence, and this time prevailed. Imhotep teleported to safety at the last moment, as Necrons tend to do when pragmatism overrides pride, but not before acknowledging the result with a line that has become something of a dark joke in Black Templar lore. One victory apiece. Helbrecht destroyed the tomb ship from the inside out. When Ghazghkull returned to Armageddon for the Third War, Helbrecht accepted the appointment as commander of all Space Marine fleet assets in the system. He did not station himself safely behind the engagement. He conducted void warfare from the bridge of the Eternal Crusader, directing engagements that outmaneuvered a numerically superior Orc fleet alongside Admiral Parole. 900 Black Templars went to the surface. The situation that produced Grimaldus was Helbrecht's war, conducted from orbit while Grimaldus dug his grave in the Temple of the Emperor Ascendant. When the Season of Fire brought the ground war to a temporary halt and Ghazghkull's flagship left Armageddon's orbit, Helbrecht made a decision that says everything about who he is. He took his fleet and he went after the Orc warlord personally, with Commissar Yarrick of the Imperial Guard alongside him, because the warlord who had done what Ghazghkull had done to Armageddon was not going to simply be allowed to leave and do it somewhere else. He has not caught Ghazghkull. That hunt continues. This is not a closed story. The question of the Primaris Space Marines deserves attention here, because it represents a genuine challenge to the chapter's identity, and Helbrecht's response to it tells you something real about how the Black Templars navigate. Change. After the Great Rift opened and tore the Imperium in half, and the Indomitus Crusade mobilized under the resurrected Primarch Robert Guilliman, the Black Templars found themselves confronted with an offer. Accept the new Primaris Space Marines into their ranks, warriors built to a higher biological specification than even the original Astartes, and integrate these new brothers into the Crusades. The offer came from Guilliman himself, and the delivery was in person aboard the Eternal Crusader, because Guilliman understood that the Black Templars were among the most temperamentally unpredictable chapters in the Imperium regarding this kind of change. He did not send a messenger, he came himself, which was the correct choice, because having a Primarch arrive at your ship to have a conversation is a considerably more compelling argument than any letter could be. Helbrecht accepted. He had conditions and concerns, and he voiced them, and Guilliman addressed them, and ultimately, the High Marshal's assessment was that the Primaris represented opportunity rather than corruption. New warriors to carry the oath forward, new strength for the Crusades. The integration was not without friction. The most serious disruption occurred during the Angevin Crusade, where the incorporation of Primaris warriors into a Black Templar crusade produced tensions that the records describe as significant, without going into specifics that would be useful for understanding what actually happened. But the broader decision held. Helbrecht himself eventually crossed the Rubicon Primaris, undergoing the additional biological transformation that turns a standard Astartes into a Primaris Marine. This is a dangerous process that kills a significant percentage of those who attempt it. The suggestion that Black Templars are particularly resilient in crossing the Rubicon, which has been noted in a number of accounts, is attributed by the chapter itself to the reward of their faith in the God Emperor. Whether that is the correct explanation is perhaps a theological question rather than a biological one. Either way, Helbrecht survived. He continues to command the Black Templars' eternal crusade across the shattered landscape of the post-Great Rift Imperium, directing wars of faith from the bridge of the Eternal Crusader and from the front lines of whatever the current priority engagement happens to be. His hand is a bionic replacement now, a visible reminder of defeat turned into renewed purpose. He does not seem to have softened. Section 11. The darkest of skies life in the ERA of the Great Rift. The opening of the Great Rift, the Cicatrix Maledictum, represents the worst thing that has happened to the Imperium since the Horus Heresy, and that is a sentence that requires an enormous amount of context to fully appreciate. The Cicatrix Maledictum is a tear in real space that runs the length of the galaxy, a wound in the fabric of the material universe through which the warp bleeds constantly. On one side is the Imperium Nihilus, the Dark Imperium, cut off from the light of the Astronomicon and plunged into a darkness that is not merely metaphorical. The Astronomicon is the psychic beacon centered on the Golden Throne and the Emperor's presence that allows navigators to guide ships through the warp. Without it, warp travel becomes navigational guesswork in a hostile dimension that would very much like to kill everyone inside. For the Black Templars, the immediate effect of the Great Rift was fragmentation. The Crusades that had been operating throughout the galaxy found themselves suddenly cut off from each other, unable to communicate, unable to coordinate, some of them separated from the chapter's supply lines and support networks by the Rift itself. Several Crusades vanished entirely in the chaos of the Noctis Aeterna, the long night of warp turbulence that followed the Rift's opening, and remain unaccounted for. High Marshal Helbrecht, according to the records, has not declared those Crusades lost. He believes they are still out there, still fighting, still pursuing the Eternal Crusade in whatever corner of the shattered galaxy they find themselves in, because they are Black Templars, and the oath they swore does not include an exception for catastrophic cosmological events that split the galaxy in half. This might sound like denial. The Black Templars would describe it as faith. The response of the chapter to the Rift's opening was not to consolidate, to pull back, to choose defensible positions and wait for conditions to improve. The response was to accelerate. Rather than using the restoration of the Astronomican signal as an opportunity to rest and regroup, the Black Templars immediately undertook a purge against the wave of mutation, heresy, and chaos worship that had bloomed in the darkness of the Noctis Aeterna. While other forces were trying to understand what had just happened, the Black Templars were already fighting the first wave of consequences. New chapter keeps were raised. Crusades that had survived the initial chaos were redirected toward the most pressing threats. The chapter's fleet-based nature, which had always been an unusual choice in a broader military culture that favored planetary bases, now demonstrated its specific advantage. A chapter whose entire operational infrastructure is mobile does not lose it to a geological event that changes the strategic map. The map changes. The fleet moves to match. The experience of fighting in the era of the Great Rift is qualitatively different from what came before, in ways that the Black Templars' theological framework is actually well suited to process. The Rift's presence means that warp phenomena are more common, more intense, and more dangerous than they were in the previous age. Daemon incursions that would once have required significant warp corruption to enable now happen with disturbing frequency in areas that should be stable Imperial space. Worlds that were secure a decade ago find themselves under assault from forces that emerge from nowhere and push toward them with nightmare intelligence. For a chapter that has a specific vow dedicated to psyker killing and warp entity destruction, and a deep conviction that their faith provides genuine spiritual protection against the warp's influence, this environment is not simply an increased threat level, it is a validation. The things they have always hated and always fought are now more present than ever. The enemy they were prepared for has come to them in greater numbers. The challenge is also one of scale. The Black Templars' strength, estimated at somewhere between 3,000 and 6,000 warriors spread across the galaxy in independent crusades, sounds enormous compared to a Codex chapter's nominal 1,000. In the context of a galaxy actively tearing itself apart, with threats emerging simultaneously on 1,000 fronts, even 6,000 warriors are a finite resource deployed across an effectively infinite problem space. The chapter's response to this is, characteristically, to fight harder rather than to strategize about resource efficiency. The concept of strategic overstretch, of carefully husbanding capability for the most critical engagements, has never been a natural fit for the Black Templar approach. They go where the need is greatest. They fight with everything they have. They accept losses as the price of service and rebuild from the gene seed of the fallen. The warriors who are fighting in this era know that they are in a different kind of dark than the one that came before. The threats are greater. The support systems are more fragile. The light that guides the fleet through the warp is less reliable than it was. And none of this changes the fundamental commitment, because none of it changes the oath, which was sworn to hold regardless of circumstances, regardless of difficulty, regardless of whether the galaxy itself is splitting open around you. If anything, the warriors of the current era understand their duty in a sharper, more urgent way than any previous generation has had to. The Eternal Crusade has always been a response to the darkness. In the Age of the Rift, the darkness is more literal than metaphor, and the Crusaders who sail through it are exactly what they have always been. Lights that do not go out. Section 12. No pity, no remorse, no fear. What it truly means to be a Black Templar. We've spent a great deal of time walking through the facts of Black Templar life. The recruitment and the transformation, the training and the combat, the faith and the battles, and the figures who embody everything the chapter stands for. And I think it's worth pausing now and asking a question that is harder to answer than it might initially appear. What is it actually like to be a Black Templar? Not in the technical sense of what your daily schedule looks like or what biological implants you've received. In the human sense, or rather in the post-human sense, that's more appropriate to what these warriors are. What is the interior experience of a life lived this way? The honest answer requires acknowledging some things that the chapter's own rhetoric does not dwell on, because rhetoric exists to inspire and to sustain, and the truth of any life, however extraordinary, is more complicated than any inspiring account of it. A Black Templar has no home. This is not a temporary circumstance or an unusual assignment. It is the permanent condition of the warrior's entire existence from the moment they pass through the aspirant trials and join the crusade. The fleet is their home in a functional sense, but the fleet is never stable, never in one place, never predictable. The community of the fighting company is the closest thing to a stable social environment they will ever have, and it is subject to continuous attrition as warriors fall in battle and are replaced by new brothers who must be integrated. A Black Templar never stops. Again, this is not a temporary deployment. It is the oath. The chapter calls this the Eternal Crusade, and they mean eternal in the most literal sense they can make it. There is no retirement. There is no period of rest at the end of an active career. There is fighting until you cannot fight anymore, and when you cannot fight anymore, you die. And if enough of you is left after you die, your gene seed is harvested so that someone else can fight in your place. The veterans who survive long enough to reach the Sword Brethren and beyond carry the weight of decades or centuries of this in their bodies and their minds, in ways that the combat record does not fully document. The external markers are there, the accumulated purity seals and battle honors, the worn edges of armor that has been repaired so many times that the original material is a minority component of what it's become. But the internal marks of that experience are something that the chapter's culture does not extensively document. Because extensive internal documentation would require a kind of psychological examination that the Black Templars find incompatible with the simplicity of purpose they consider essential to their function. What they have instead of psychological examination is faith, and faith, genuinely and totally held, does something real to the experience of living this way. It provides a framework in which none of the things that would break a normal person, the loss of home, the loss of brothers, the loss of rest, the loss of any future that looks different from the present, register as losses. They register as gifts. The opportunity to serve, the privilege of being among the chosen, the confirmation that the Emperor has need of you and has therefore kept you alive to continue. This is not cynicism or manipulation. The warriors who hold this faith hold it the way the sun holds light, not because they were persuaded to, but because it is the most fundamental fact of who they are. Sigismund's oath and the identity it created did not just shape the Black Templars' tactics or organizational structure. It shaped the very experience of being a Black Templar, the felt sense of what life means and what it's for, and whether it's going the way it should. When a Black Templar stands over a fallen enemy, breathing the smoke of a battle that ended 30 seconds ago, with the chainsword still running in his hand, there is something in that moment that the warriors themselves describe in terms that are, genuinely, the language of spiritual experience. Not satisfaction in the way a hunter feels satisfaction, something larger. The sense of having been the instrument of a god's will, having placed themselves between the darkness and the light, having proved for another day that the oath is not hollow, that is not nothing. That is, in its own way, something that most lives do not contain. The brutality of what they do is real. The enemies they fight are capable of horrifying things, and the Black Templars' response to horrifying things is not measured or restrained. They do not distinguish between combatants and populations in every case. They have wiped out planetary populations whose faith was judged insufficient. They have conducted purges that the Inquisition, not known for excessive squeamishness, has had to look twice at. They have fought with a disregard for civilian casualties that other imperial forces found difficult to watch. This is part of the record. The chapter does not deny it. They do not consider it a problem to be apologized for, because in their theological framework, a population that has been touched by heresy or been found wanting in their devotion to the Emperor is a population that has made a choice, and that choice has consequences. The Black Templars provide the consequences. The idea that providing those consequences makes them something less than righteous warriors of the Imperium is, from their perspective, simply incorrect. People who feel very differently about this will point to it as evidence that fanaticism without check is dangerous, regardless of the sincerity of the fanatics. The Black Templars would point to 10,000 years of unbroken service and an eternal crusade that has saved more worlds than most chapters have even heard of, and say, look at the results. Both things are true, and the tension between them is something the 40k universe is extremely good at holding without resolving. What makes the Black Templars compelling, beyond the battles and the famous figures and the dramatic aesthetics of black armor and white crosses and warriors covered in parchment vows, is this. They are the version of the question, what would you sacrifice for something you truly believed in, taken to its absolute limit, and then taken further? Most people who claim they would give everything for something they believe in have not tested the limit of that claim. The Black Templars have. They found the edge of that question and stepped over it, and kept walking, and have been walking ever since. The sacrifice is total. The commitment is permanent. And within the chapter's own understanding, this is not a tragedy, it is the point. No pity, because pity would imply that you believe what you are doing to the Emperor's enemies is something to feel sorry about, and they do not. No remorse, because remorse would imply that the path you have chosen, the oath you have sworn, the life you are living, is one you would have chosen differently if you could, and they would not. No fear, because fear is what happens when you are uncertain about whether what comes next is worth what it will cost. And these warriors are not uncertain. They have been certain since the moment the vision of Sigismund's oath took root in their hearts, and that certainty does not dim with distance or time or loss. The Black Templars stand in the dark of the 41st millennium, with their faith held in front of them like a torch, and the torch does not go out, and there are always more enemies ahead, and they are always willing to walk toward them. 10,000 years and counting. No pity, no remorse, no fear. Afterward, the crusade continues. There is something quietly remarkable about the fact that the Black Templars' defining characteristic is, at its core, the refusal to accept that the fight is over. Not the refusal to acknowledge that the enemy is strong, not the refusal to recognize that circumstances are terrible, the specific, pointed, sworn refusal to accept that the work is done. In a universe that is running out of hope by most reasonable metrics, where the galaxy is literally tearing itself apart, and the enemies of mankind are more numerous and more terrible than at any point in recorded history, that refusal is not naive. It is, in some difficult-to-articulate sense, exactly what the moment requires. The Black Templars were built by a man who knew the Great Crusade would never end. That knowledge, far from paralyzing him, was the source of everything he became and everything the chapter after him would be. If the work will never be finished, then the correct response is not grief. It is to simply never stop working. Somewhere out in the void between the stars, black-hulled ships move through the dark. Inside them, warriors pray and train and wait for the drop. The chainswords are maintained. The purity seals are renewed. The vows are taken. And the eternal crusade continues. If you made it to the end of this one, you are an absolute legend, and I deeply appreciate you spending this time here. This community genuinely makes it worth putting these scripts together, and I'd love to know, where are you watching from? What time is it where you are right now? Drop it in the comments. And if this video gave you something, whether that's a deeper appreciation for one of the most compelling factions in all of Warhammer, or just a couple of hours of something interesting to have on while you do other things, the best way to tell me that is to hit subscribe and stick around for what comes next. There is always more to tell. The galaxy is large and very, very dark, and we are just getting started. For the Emperor. Expanded section. The weight of the oath. How Black Templars understand mortality and meaning. There is a question that the Black Templars do not ask themselves, and the fact that they do not ask it is itself one of the most revealing things about who they are. They do not ask whether it is worth it. That question, the fundamental question of value and trade-off that underpins almost every decision a thinking being makes about how to spend the time they have, simply does not arise within the Black Templar framework of meaning, not because they are incapable of asking it. Not because the question has been beaten out of them through some program of psychological conditioning designed to remove their ability to reflect on their circumstances, but because the answer is so completely settled, at such a foundational level, that the question itself dissolves before it can fully form. It is worth it, because the Emperor requires it. That is the end of the calculus. Everything else is details. To understand how this works inside the mind of an actual Black Templar warrior, you have to appreciate that their faith is not the kind of faith that operates in a separate compartment from their reasoning. It is not the kind of belief that a person holds carefully alongside their more practical understanding of the world, taking it out for specific occasions and then putting it away when the immediate demands of life require clear thinking. For the Black Templars, faith is the lens through which clear thinking happens. It is not a supplement to their reason. It is the organizing principle of it. When an initiate who has been fighting for 40 years looks at the condition of his life, he does not compare it to some alternative. The comparison is not available to him because the alternative never existed. He was born into whatever desperate circumstance produced him, survived the brutal selection process that took him from that circumstance, was transformed by the gene seed into something that bears only a loose biological relationship to what he was before, and then began fighting in a crusade that has been running for longer than most civilizations have existed. At what point in that sequence would the question, "Is this worth it?" find purchase? The frame of reference required for the question is missing. There is only this, and within this, the faith that gives it meaning, and the brothers fighting beside him, and the next engagement, and the prayer that prepared him for it. This is not emptiness. The non-philosophically inclined reader might interpret the absence of certain kinds of self-examination as a poverty of interior life, as warriors who have been reduced to unthinking instruments. But that reading misses something important. The Black Templars have, in the language of their own culture, an extremely rich interior life. It is organized around entirely different questions than the ones most people spend their time on, but the depth and sincerity of that engagement is entirely real. What they examine constantly and rigorously is their spiritual condition. Are they maintaining the purity of their faith? Are their vows being honored in the spirit in which they were taken, not just in the technical letter? Is the fire of their devotion burning as brightly as it was when they first swore the oath, or has time and repetition dulled the edge of something that must be kept sharp? Is their hatred of the Emperor's enemies genuine and maintained, or is it beginning to calcify into routine, into a professional attitude, rather than a burning conviction? The chaplain's role in addressing these questions is constant and intensive. A warrior who has begun to feel the weight of his service as something he carries rather than something he embraces is a warrior who needs spiritual attention, not in a gentle or comfortable way, but in the abrasive and demanding way that the Black Templars apply to everything they consider important. The chaplain who speaks to such a warrior does not counsel rest or perspective. He reminds the warrior of Sigismund. He describes in visceral detail what the enemies of the Emperor do to the worlds they reach. He leads the warrior through prayers that are less comfortable than they are challenging, prayers that demand a response rather than simply offering soothing words. This is not therapy. It is more like a whetstone applied to a blade that has gone slightly dull, working against it with deliberate friction until the edge is back. The result, most of the time, is that the warrior finds the fire again. Not because the friction was pleasant, but because the friction reminded him that the fire was always there, just buried under the routine that any sufficiently long-sustained effort eventually develops over its most important moments. What happens when it does not work? When the fire does not come back, and the warrior is left with the husk of a commitment without the living conviction that should inhabit it? This is not something the Black Templars write about extensively in their accessible records, but the existence of the Crusade of Penitence as an institutional response to failure suggests that the chapter has thought carefully about this problem. When a warrior or a leader has failed in some significant way, whether in battle or in faith, the response is not censure or administrative consequence. It is war conducted as penance, more war, harder war. War chosen specifically because of the spiritual weight it offers rather than the strategic opportunity it represents. War is the cure for what ails you, in the Black Templar medical philosophy. The sustained brutality of this approach to every form of difficulty is something that requires some form of foundation to stand on, and that foundation is community. The bonds between warriors in a fighting company, the relationship between a neophyte and his initiate, the respect among sword brethren who have served together across decades of campaigns. These are real and genuine relationships that provide something in the interior life of each warrior that the theological framework supports but does not fully replace. Even the most faith-driven warrior is still someone who needs people around him who know who he is and what he's been through. The Black Templars, in their own way, understand this. The Crusader Squad is not just a tactical unit. It is a social one. The intensity of shared combat experience, of standing in the breach together and seeing what each person is actually made of when everything is on the line, creates bonds that are difficult to form any other way and nearly impossible to replace once they exist. These bonds are part of what the chapter offers its warriors alongside purpose and identity. It is part of why the loss of battle brothers is felt, even within a culture that frames such losses as honored and expected. Expanded section, the chaplains, shepherds of the zealous heart. If the sword brethren are the finest fighters the chapter produces, the chaplains are its soul made manifest in human form. And in a chapter where soul and sword are meant to be the same thing, this is a position of enormous weight. The formal title for the most senior chaplain of a crusade is reclusiarch, a word that carries echoes of ancient monastic language, the keeper of the cloister, the one who holds the interior life of the community as his primary charge. In Grimaldus, we see one reclusiarch in close detail. But every crusade has one, and every fighting company has its own chaplain, who occupies a position closer to the front lines of pastoral work. A chaplain's armor is distinctive even within the Black Templars' already visually distinctive culture, where an initiate's black armor is his combat identity, built up with personal honors and history across decades of service. A chaplain's black is different in quality. It is the black of office, of function, of a role that exists beyond the individual who fills it. Their helms bear skull-faced visors, a visual declaration that the chaplain walks with the dead as well as the living, that his authority derives from the weight of all those who have come before, and whose traditions he maintains. The Crozius Arcanum, the mace-like weapon that chaplains carry, is both a symbol of their religious authority and a genuinely lethal weapon. It is an energy weapon, capable of striking with considerable force, but its primary significance is ceremonial and spiritual. When a chaplain raises his Crozius during the charge, the warriors who see it understand that what follows is not merely violence. It is the expression of the Emperor's judgment, delivered through the arms of his servants. The liturgy of the Black Templars is extensive and complex in ways that would probably surprise an outside observer who assumed that a chapter oriented toward action rather than reflection would have abbreviated ritual traditions. In practice, the opposite is true. The more completely a culture is defined by a specific set of values, the more elaborate the rituals that express and reinforce those values tend to become. Every significant moment in the life of the chapter, from a warrior's first deployment to the eve of a major battle to the death rites for a fallen brother, is wrapped in ceremony that takes considerable time and attention to perform correctly. The chaplain is the master of this ceremony, in the same way that a master craftsman is the master of a complex and demanding art form. The words of the prayers have been refined over 10,000 years. The sequence of ritual actions has been developed through trial and experience into forms that are understood to be effective, not simply beautiful. When a chaplain leads the pre-battle vigil and the warriors kneel in prayer through the long dark hours before a drop, this is not theater for the benefit of morale. It is, in the chaplain's sincere understanding and the warrior's sincere experience, a real interaction with a real divine presence. The Emperor's attention to his crusaders, the psychic impression of his will transmitted through the machinery of their faith, the moment when a vision descends on a battle brother and the next Emperor's champion is identified. The path to becoming a chaplain within the Black Templars typically passes through the Sword Brethren. The spiritual leaders of the chapter are expected to have proven themselves as warriors first, because in a culture that understands war as the primary expression of devotion, a shepherd of the faithful who has not walked through the same fire as his flock carries less authority than one who has. The chapter's theology is not theoretical. Its practitioners need to be people who have applied it under the worst possible conditions and found it sufficient. The chaplain who stands beside Grimaldus at Hell's Reach, or who conducts the blessing before a boarding action against a Necron tomb ship, or who administers the last rites to a warrior who has taken a wound that the apothecaries cannot save, is doing all of these things from the same interior place. The same faith that makes the prayer possible makes the fighting possible. They are expressions of the same conviction, which is that what they are doing matters, that the Emperor sees it, and that their willingness to pour themselves out in his service is the most meaningful thing any of them will ever do. Expanded section. The Eternal Crusader, the ship that is also a soul. The Eternal Crusader has existed for 10,000 years. Think about what that means in practical terms before we engage with what it means symbolically. 10,000 years is longer than written human history on ancient Terra. It is longer than the gap between modern readers and the first cities built along the rivers of ancient Mesopotamia. In that span of time, the ship has been refitted, modified, expanded, repaired, rebuilt in sections, had entire sections torn out and replaced with new ones, and had those new sections undergo their own cycles of refitting and modification. It is, at this point, a vessel whose relationship to the original hull it was built around is approximately as intimate as a living person's relationship to the cells in their body when they were 7 years old, almost entirely replaced, but continuous. The ship is a Gloriana-class battleship, one of the ancient behemoths constructed during the age of the Great Crusade itself, designed to serve as the flagship of a Primarch and the center of gravity for a legion's operations. After 10 millennia of the treatment described above, it is no longer simply a Gloriana-class vessel in the way the term was originally understood. It is a specific ship with a specific character, a vessel that has absorbed the history of the chapter in its very structure. The Black Legion boarded the Eternal Crusader during the First Black Crusade, when Abaddon came looking for Sigismund. They fought their way deep into the ship before the battle resolved itself in the way we have already discussed. The boarding left damage that required significant repair, and some accounts suggest that certain areas of the ship that were devastated in that assault have been deliberately preserved in their damaged state, sealed sections that serve as permanent reminders of the most costly battle the ship has ever hosted. Inside the Eternal Crusader, there are chapels that have been in continuous use since before the chapter was formally constituted, where the prayers of 10,000 years have left something behind in the walls and the air, some quality that worshippers describe as a presence, a sense of being in a place that is not merely full of memories, but is somehow defined by them. Sacred relics are stored in reliquaries that have themselves become sacred through association, cases, and cabinets, and sealed vaults containing objects whose significance the chapter maintains in meticulous detail, even as the cultural knowledge of the broader Imperium long since moved on from caring about them. The Chamber of the First Proclamation, Sigismund's Hall, is the room where Rogaldorn formally recognized the Black Templars as a chapter, the moment when Sigismund's great oath received its institutional validation. But it is also the room where that validation happened aboard a ship that is still in service, still flying, still the heart of the chapter that validation created. The room has not been preserved as a museum piece. It is still used. The High Marshal meets with his marshals there. Significant council decisions are announced there. The physical location of the founding moment has not been cordoned off and made static. It is woven into the ongoing life of the chapter that grew from the founding. What does it feel like to stand in that room, knowing that the man who stood here 10,000 years ago made the promise that is the reason you exist? What does it feel like to speak in the same space where Sigismund's voice first shaped the words of the Eternal Crusade into an institutional commitment? For a Black Templar who has grown up with the oath as the central fact of his identity, the answer to this question is probably not something that can be adequately expressed in language, which is why the chamber is used for decisions and declarations, rather than for ordinary meetings. It is the space the chapter reserves for its most serious moments, the space where what is said carries the weight of the 10,000 years behind it. The warriors who move through the Eternal Crusader each day are living in a place that is the accumulated statement of everything the chapter has ever been, and done, and lost, and won. It is not a neutral environment. It pushes on them, the weight of that history, and the push is meant to be felt. It is designed to make you remember what you are part of. That is the highest function any structure can serve. Expanded section. What the Black Templars look like in motion. We have talked extensively about the Black Templars' psychology and theology and history, but there is a purely visual and kinetic dimension to what they are that deserves its own consideration, because the experience of encountering Black Templars on a battlefield is not like the experience of encountering most other military forces. The black armor is the first thing you see, and black armor in the context of the 41st millennium is a specific visual statement. Most Space Marine chapters wear colors that speak to heritage or home: the blue and gold of the Ultramarines, the green of the Salamanders, the gray of the Space Wolves. The Black Templar's black says something different. It says what the armor of chaplains says across all chapters. These warriors answer to something higher than institutional allegiance. They serve the Emperor directly, with faith as the primary currency of their devotion, and the black is the uniform of that direct service. Against the black, the white of the shoulder pads and the Maltese cross heraldry creates a contrast that is sharp and immediate, readable at distance, even in the chaos of a battle. It is a deliberate aesthetic choice that also functions as a tactical one, because warriors who can be easily identified by their own forces in the confusion of close combat operate more effectively than those who cannot. The white is also a statement about purity, about the clarity of purpose that the black faith is meant to protect, the darkness of total devotion surrounding and preserving something uncorrupted at the center. The tabards and robes that hang from the armor of many Black Templars are the medieval element that makes the visual language immediately recognizable as crusading. Where other Space Marine chapters might feel like futuristic super soldiers, the Black Templars feel like futuristic crusaders, and the distinction is intentional and important. The chapter's self-understanding is explicitly tied to the tradition of holy warriors fighting in the name of their god, and the visual language reflects that self-understanding without being asked to. These warriors look the way they do because they understand themselves to be what they look like. The purity seals and crusade seals that adorn Black Templar armor are not decorative in any superficial sense. Each one is a physical record of something spiritually significant, a vow taken, a deed performed, a sin confessed, and discharged through whatever means the chaplains deemed appropriate. The Sword Brethren, who have survived long enough to accumulate decades or centuries of such moments, are sometimes nearly covered in them, their armor's surface becoming an archive of a life spent in the Emperor's service. When they charge, the noise they make is distinctive. The screaming of chainswords runs at a frequency that is difficult to hear, without visceral response, even when you are not the target. The rhythmic thunder of bolter fire, each shot a self-propelled explosive projectile, creates a concussive texture of sound that fills every available space. Over all of it, the voices of the warriors chanting litanies, not roaring or screaming, but chanting, measured and unified even in the middle of a charge that a rational observer would describe as suicidal. No pity, no remorse, no fear. The words are spoken on the charge. They have been spoken on charges for 10,000 years, on 1,000 different worlds, against every kind of enemy that has ever threatened mankind. They will be spoken again tomorrow, and the day after that, and every day that follows, until there are no more days left to count. That is the Black Templars. That is the life they live. And it is, in every possible sense of the word, eternal. Expanded section. Honor duels, feuds, and the culture of personal challenge. One of the most specifically unusual aspects of Black Templar culture, even within the broad range of unusual cultural practices that Space Marine chapters maintain, is the formalized role of personal challenge and individual honor in determining how the chapter operates at every level. The tradition traces directly to Sigismund, whose defining acts were acts of personal challenge, walking out in front of the walls of the Imperial Palace, challenging champions of chaos, one at a time, meeting Abaddon in single combat despite every rational assessment of the situation favoring the alternative. The pattern set by the chapter's founder was not one of collective military professionalism applied through organizational discipline, though that is also present. It was one of individual warriors, placing themselves personally against the most dangerous opposition available, and testing whether their faith and their skill were sufficient. The Emperor's champion role is the most dramatic institutional expression of this value, but honor duels and personal challenges show up throughout the chapter's culture in less dramatic contexts as well. When serious disagreements arise between warriors that require resolution beyond what ordinary discussion can achieve, the Black Templars turn to the most direct method available. They fight it out under controlled conditions, witnessed by the chaplains, with the result accepted as the Emperor's judgment on the matter. This is not anarchic. It is not two warriors settling a grudge with unrefereed violence. There are forms. There is a chaplain present who blesses the contest and ensures that it runs according to the prescribed manner. The fight stops at a defined threshold, usually when one warrior yields or is incapacitated to the point of inability to continue, rather than running to a potentially lethal conclusion unless the matter is grave enough to warrant it. And the result is binding in the way that a judicial ruling is binding. Not in the sense that the loser is compelled to agree with the outcome, but in the sense that the chapter's community accepts the result as settled. For the selection of new marshals from among the Sword Brethren when a previous marshal falls, the process is more open-ended. This is not a controlled duel with a defined stopping point. This is the Sword Brethren of the household, demonstrating through combat, which among them is the one the Emperor would choose to lead. The process runs until consensus emerges, which in practice means until the demonstration is sufficiently complete that all parties can see who the right choice is. This is a different thing from a conventional leadership selection, even within the chapter's own culture, because the goal is not to determine who can beat everyone else in a brawl. It is to demonstrate, through the language the chapter finds most credible, who has been granted the capability and the calling to lead. The Emperor's champion tradition applies this same logic at its most elevated and most personal level. The warrior who receives the vision is not chosen because of demonstrated superiority in any measurable category. He is chosen because the Emperor chose him, and the Emperor's criteria are expressed through the vision itself, through what the warrior experiences, and how the chaplains read that experience against the tradition. It is a form of personal challenge that the warrior cannot prepare for or earn through conventional effort, which makes it the purest expression of the value system, the one place where personal merit in the understood sense gives way entirely to divine selection. This culture of personal challenge has practical consequences that observers from outside sometimes find puzzling. A Black Templar who has the vow, accept any challenge, no matter the odds, active in battle, will literally seek out the most dangerous enemy on the field and attempt to close with it personally. From a purely tactical standpoint, this is not always optimal. From the chapter's theological standpoint, it is exactly what should happen, because the point is not to win efficiently. The point is to demonstrate, through the willingness to face the most dangerous thing present, that your faith is genuine and your commitment is total. The fact that this approach sometimes produces victories that efficient tactics would not have achieved, breakthroughs against overwhelming opposition, the defeat of enemy leaders who should have been untouchable, is taken by the chapter as confirmation that the approach is correct. Whether this is faith-producing outcomes or selection bias, producing memorable stories, is a question that different observers answer differently. The Black Templars' answer is the same one they give to most difficult questions. The Emperor provides for those who serve him faithfully. You need no other explanation. Expanded section: the Apothecaries and the Gene Seed Harvest. In most Space Marine chapters, the apothecary is a figure of complex and sometimes conflicting responsibilities. He is a healer, responsible for treating wounded warriors and preserving life where it can be preserved. He is also a harvester, responsible for recovering the gene seed of the fallen. And these two responsibilities sometimes exist in tension. For the Black Templars, the tension is somewhat reduced by the clarity of their priorities. Healing is important. Life is valuable. But the gene seed is not simply important, it is the mechanism by which the chapter continues to exist. Every warrior who falls, and whose gene seed is successfully recovered, contributes to the next generation of Black Templars. Every warrior who falls, and whose gene seed is lost, represents a gap that will be harder to fill. The apothecaries who travel with Black Templar crusades are highly capable medical practitioners, but they operate in an environment that does not always permit the careful, controlled medical practice that their training covers. They work on the battlefield, in the middle of engagements, under fire, often having to make rapid decisions about which wounded warrior can be saved, and which has already passed the threshold where intervention would be meaningful. The Narthecium, the medical tool that apothecaries carry, is designed for both functions simultaneously. One end handles medical treatment. The other contains the reductor, a device specifically designed to extract the gene seed organs from the bodies of the fallen. In the worst moments of the worst battles, an apothecary may find himself choosing between attempting to save a gravely wounded warrior and ensuring that the warrior's gene seed is recovered before the enemy can desecrate or destroy the body. This choice is made in the tradition of the chapter, which means it is made in the understanding that the gene seed is the longer-term value. A warrior who dies today, but whose gene seed is recovered, can contribute to the warriors who will fight in his name for the next century. A warrior who is saved, but whose gene seed might have been lost to enemy interference, is a different calculation entirely. The Black Templars do not regard this calculus as callous. They regard it as the correct prioritization of what matters most in the long view that the Eternal Crusade demands. The individual warrior's life is precious. The chapter's continuity across time is more precious, not because any individual is worth less than any other, but because the chapter is the vehicle through which the oath is fulfilled, and the oath is older and larger than any single warrior who serves within it. When the gene seed is successfully recovered and returned to the fleet, the apothecaries work to preserve and culture it, preparing it for eventual implantation in the next generation of neophytes. This process requires skill, careful monitoring, and the kind of biological science that sits at the intersection of the empirical and the semi-mystical in the 41st millennium, where many of the processes involved are understood at the practical level without being fully understood at the theoretical one. The gene seed of Rogel Dorn, which runs through the Black Templars, is considered among the cleanest and most stable in the Imperium. Unlike some gene seed lineages that have developed significant mutations or degradations over 10,000 years, the Imperial Fist's gene seed and that of their successors has maintained a quality that the apothecaries take quiet pride in. This is not accidental. It is the product of 10,000 years of careful stewardship, rigorous screening of aspirants, and the rejection of candidates who show any sign of genetic irregularity that might compromise the purity of what is passed on. Expanded section heresy, mutation, and the price of inflexibility. The Black Templars' absolute intolerance of deviation from the Emperor's light is one of their defining characteristics, and it is one that has produced both their greatest moments and some of their most morally complex ones. To understand this fully, you have to appreciate what the galaxy looks like from the inside of the Black Templar worldview. They live in a universe where the most catastrophic event in human history, the Horus Heresy, was caused by corruption, by loyal warriors who were turned, some through persuasion, some through deception, some through the gradual erosion of values that should have been non-negotiable. The lesson the Black Templars drew from this is not subtle. Deviation is how corruption enters. Tolerance of deviation is how corruption spreads. The only reliable defense against the pattern is zero tolerance at the point of first contact. A heretic who has just begun to waver in their faith is not a soul to be reclaimed through patient theological argument. In the Black Templar understanding, they are a vector for the spread of something that will, if left unchecked, corrupt everyone around them. The appropriate response is the same response you apply to any infection that could spread. Eliminate it before it does. This logic is internally consistent. It is also the logic that has led to planetary purges of populations whose faith was found wanting, to the burning of worlds that might have been saved through more patient intervention, to the deaths of civilians who were guilty of insufficient devotion rather than active betrayal. The Black Templars accept these outcomes as necessary because their calculus places the purity of the surviving community above the lives of those whose purity is in question. The Inquisition, which has its own robust tradition of resolving theological uncertainty through violence, has occasionally had to negotiate with the Black Templars about where the line between righteous purification and destructive excess should be drawn. These negotiations are not always comfortable for either party. There is a genuine philosophical tension here that the Black Templars do not resolve so much as decline, to acknowledge as a tension. The question, is it possible to be too zealous in defense of the Emperor's light, receives from the chapter a response that amounts to no. Excessive zeal in the Emperor's service is not possible because the Emperor's service has no upper limit. You cannot do more for him than he deserves. Therefore, you cannot go too far in his name. The counter-argument that a military force which treats insufficient faith as a capital offense will inevitably make errors that destroy innocent people is not an argument the chapter finds compelling. In the Black Templar framework, there are no innocent people who are also insufficiently devoted to the Emperor. Insufficient devotion to the Emperor makes you, by definition, someone whose innocence in other respects is outweighed by the most important failure a person can have. This is a position that most outside observers find extreme, including many within the Imperium, who are themselves not particularly squeamish about religious violence. It is also a position that has been held with complete sincerity and complete consistency for 10,000 years, without producing significant internal dissent, which tells you something about how thoroughly the chapter's culture has internalized it. What it means in practice for the warriors who carry it is that they operate without the kind of moral hesitation that more moderate value systems would generate at the threshold of extreme action. A Black Templar ordered to purge a population that has been found wanting does not spend the night before it in a crisis of conscience. He spends it in prayer, thanking the Emperor for the opportunity to serve, asking for the strength to do what is necessary with the precision and totality it deserves, and going to sleep confident that in the morning he will do it correctly. Whether that confidence is a virtue or a danger, or somehow both, is a question. The 40k universe is uniquely positioned to hold without answering. The darkness of the setting means that both things can be true simultaneously, that the Black Templar's certainty has saved worlds that softer responses would have lost, and that the same certainty has destroyed things that patience and mercy might have preserved. Expanded section. The Land Raider, Crusader, and the Tools of Holy War. Every Space Marine chapter has signature equipment, weapons, and vehicles that reflect the chapter's tactical doctrine and cultural priorities. For the Black Templars, the most iconic vehicle, is one they effectively invented. The Land Raider Crusader is the result of the Black Templars, looking at the standard Land Raider, one of the most heavily armored vehicles available to the Adeptus Astartes, and deciding that while it was formidable, it had been optimized for the wrong thing. The standard Land Raider carries twin lascannons, weapons of enormous power, designed for destroying vehicles and fortifications at significant range. These weapons fit the Imperial Fist's fortress combat doctrine perfectly. They are terrible tools for the Black Templars, who are not interested in fighting at significant range, and who consider tanks primarily as things that deliver warriors into close combat, rather than as fire support platforms. The modification is simple and total. The lascannons come out, hurricane pattern bolters go in, multiple barrel bolter assemblies that put out an enormous volume of anti-infantry fire at short to medium range. The internal troop compartment is expanded to carry more warriors. The assault ramp is reinforced to allow rapid disembarkation. The entire vehicle becomes, in engineering terms, a battering ram that can also shoot. This modification happened at some point in the early history of the chapter, and the Black Templars were the first to use it in active service. Other chapters subsequently adopted the design once they saw it in operation, recognizing that the specific combination of assault, transport, and short-range fire support it offered was useful even for chapters whose primary tactical philosophy was not as aggressively close-ranged as the Black Templars. The vehicle's name, the Land Raider Crusader, is not an accident. It is a statement. This is what a Crusader's tank looks like. It is designed to carry Crusaders into the heart of the enemy's position and deliver them into the personal combat where their faith and their blades can do what they were made to do. The chainsword itself deserves attention as the weapon most associated with the Black Templars' battlefield identity. The bolter is the standard weapon of the Adeptus Astartes, and the Black Templars use it, but in their usage, it is primarily a tool for suppression and approach. You fire the bolter to keep the enemy's heads down while you cover the ground between you. You fire it to reduce the incoming fire that might slow the charge. You fire it because the charge has to cover a certain amount of distance before it can do what a charge is for, and that distance needs to be managed. But the chainsword is the weapon of the thing a charge is for. It is the weapon that closes all distance to zero, that requires you to be close enough to feel the heat of your enemy's breath, that resolves the question of faith and skill and courage in the most immediate and personal terms available. In Black Templar culture, the ability to fight well with the chainsword, to use it not just as a bludgeoning instrument, but with the precision and economy of a practiced swordsman, is the mark of a warrior who has genuinely internalized what the chapter values. The chapter has warriors who specialize in other weapons, heavy bolters, plasma guns, melta-weapons, the various specialized armaments that cover the tactical gaps a pure, close combat force would have. But the chainsword is the weapon of the cultural ideal. It is what Sigismund's black sword represents at the most accessible, most everyday scale. The sword in the hand, the fight within arm's reach, the resolution of everything by direct and personal violence. Purity seals and the rosarius, the faith-infused shield generators that chaplains carry, are the spiritual weaponry that complements the physical armament. The Black Templars understand their weapons as both practical tools and sacred objects in a way that makes the distinction between maintenance and ritual difficult to draw. The prayers spoken over a weapon before it is taken into battle are not merely ceremonial. They are a genuine investment in the weapon's function, a preparation of the object for the sacred purpose it is about to serve. A newly forged chainsword that has never been used in battle is different from one that has fought across 50 worlds and been blessed before each engagement, and had the blood of hundreds of the Emperor's enemies dried into its mechanisms. Not in the metallurgical sense. In the sense that the Black Templars would argue matters most, the weight of its history, the accumulated record of its service, the continuity of purpose it represents. These things matter to the Black Templars in ways that sometimes make the more pragmatic warrior cultures of the Imperium raise their eyebrows. But then, most of those more pragmatic warrior cultures are not 10,000 years into an eternal crusade driven by the sheer force of a single oath made by a single remarkable man. Closing expansion, the meaning of the eternal. 10,000 years is a number that resists full comprehension, in the same way that astronomical distances resist full comprehension. You can say the words, and you can do the arithmetic, and the quantity is technically accurate, but the lived reality of what that span means does not fit inside the human brain in a way that makes it feel real. The Black Templars have been crusading for longer than the gap between the present reader and the fall of the Western Roman Empire, doubled, and then doubled again. They have been fighting continuously since before the ancestors of every human civilization currently in existence formed the first proto-linguistic sounds that would eventually become language, and they have not stopped. Every high marshal who has ever taken the role has looked at the vastness of that commitment and renewed it, not maintained it, not continued it by institutional inertia or the absence of any alternative, actively chosen it, sworn it fresh, made it their own rather than simply inherited it. The Eternal Crusade survives not because there is no mechanism to end it, but because no one has wanted to end it. That is the most extraordinary thing about the Black Templars when you sit with it long enough. Not their size, which is remarkable, not their battlefield record, which spans millennia and includes some of the most decisive engagements in imperial history. Not their unique theological framework, or their refusal to follow the Codex, or their hatred of psychers, or any of the specific features that make them interesting as a faction. The most extraordinary thing is that they chose this. Over and over again, every single generation, they chose it. The oath could have been allowed to decay. The concept of an eternal crusade could have gradually softened into something that sounded eternal, but wasn't. The way most ideals do when you give them enough time and enough competing pressures. It didn't soften. It got harder. Each generation of warriors found the same burning conviction that Sigismund ignited 1,000 years before them and carried it forward without diminution. Each high marshal found the oath as binding and as urgent as his predecessor had, despite the fact that the galaxy they were fighting in had changed enormously, and the specific nature of the enemies they faced had evolved in ways that Sigismund could not have predicted. The cultural mechanisms for maintaining this intensity across 10 millennia are worth examining, not because they are mysterious, but because they are effective in ways that most institutional cultures are not. The chaplains who reinforce the faith, the relics that connect the present to the founding moment, the rituals that perform the same actions in the same sequence generation after generation, the chapter's deliberate decision not to root itself in any single place that could be lost or changed beyond recognition, all of these work together to create a cultural continuity that is resilient against the passage of time, in ways that geographically anchored cultures are not. There is no Sigismund's homeland that has been conquered or rebuilt or changed beyond recognition. There is no founding city that has become something else over the centuries. There is only the fleet and the oath and the fight, and these three things are portable and renewable, and do not depend on any external circumstance remaining stable to support them. This is why the great rift's shattering of the Imperium, while devastating in countless ways, did not break the Black Templars. Their identity is not invested in any geographic or institutional stability that the rift could destroy. Their identity is invested in an oath, and an oath lives in the hearts of those who swear it, and as long as there are Black Templars who have sworn it, the oath continues. Somewhere out there right now, as you hear these words, there are Black Templars deploying from strike cruisers toward a world that needs saving or cleansing or both. There are neophytes, learning from their initiates in the brutal and immediate classroom of live combat. There are sword brethren cleaning weapons that have seen more centuries of use than most civilizations have managed to exist. There is a chaplain somewhere, conducting a pre-battle vigil under candlelight, the prayers rising in a dialect that has been refined across 10,000 years, waiting to see if the emperor will send a vision and name his champion for the day's work. And there are enemies ahead. There are always enemies ahead. The galaxy ensures this. The enemies do not run out. They multiply and evolve and find new forms and new strengths and new methods, and every new form they take is met by the same response from the crusaders who find them, the same charge, the same chainswords, the same faith held at the center of the warrior, like a light that no darkness has yet managed to reach, no pity, no remorse. No fear. The crusade continues, 10,000 years and counting. If you stayed with this all the way to the end, you are exactly the kind of person who makes this worth doing. The Black Templars are one of the most fully realized faction concepts in all of Warhammer 40k. and I genuinely hope this gave you something new or deepened something you already loved about them. Drop a comment. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are right now. I love knowing who is on the other end of this. And if you found any value in spending this time here, the single best thing you can do is subscribe and stick around. There is always more story to tell in this universe, and the dark between the stars is full of it. For the Emperor, no pity, no remorse, no fear. Final section. The crusade that never ends, connecting the past to the present. It would be easy to think of the Black Templars as a relic, a chapter whose defining characteristics were forged in a specific set of historical circumstances, and whose continued existence represents a kind of preserved amber, something ancient kept intact, past the point where the conditions that created it still apply. That reading is wrong, and it is wrong in an interesting way that reveals something true about what the chapter has actually become across 10 millennia. The Black Templars were created in response to a specific crisis, the Second Founding and the accusations of disloyalty that surrounded the Imperial Fist's resistance to the Codex Astartes. Sigismund's oath was, in one reading, a piece of political theater, a grand gesture, designed to demonstrate beyond any possible accusation that the warriors of the Imperial Fist's bloodline were loyal to the Emperor, and would prove it continuously and publicly for as long as it took. In this reading, the Eternal Crusade was always meant to end eventually, when the loyalty was sufficiently proven and the political climate permitted a return to something more conventionally organized. This reading is certainly available, and it explains the form of the original decision, but it does not explain what happened next. The chapter that Sigismund built did not understand itself as conducting a finite demonstration. It understood itself as fulfilling a permanent obligation. And, in the 10,000 years since the founding, that understanding has only deepened. The political circumstances that made the original gesture necessary are long forgotten by everyone except historians. The chapter that continues the crusade does so because the crusade is who they are, not because anyone is still watching to see if they'll stop. This evolution from political demonstration to genuine identity is one of the most fascinating things about Black Templar history, and it happened quietly, without any single moment where someone declared the transition complete. It happened because each generation of warriors was raised in the culture that the previous generation had maintained, was given an identity, before they were given an explanation for why that identity took the form it did. And by the time they were old enough and experienced enough to ask why the crusade continues, the answer, because we are crusaders, had already become more true than any historical explanation could be. The Black Templars, in the era of the Great Rift, are not maintaining a tradition. They are a tradition that has become its own justification, self-sustaining at the level of identity, rather than dependent on any external rationale. This is why Robert Guilliman's return, as disruptive as it was to so many chapter cultures, did not fundamentally alter who the Black Templars were. Guilliman could argue with their organizational structure. He could offer them Primaris Marines. He could remind them of their obligations to the broader Imperium. But he could not alter the fact that these warriors had been crusading for 10,000 years, and that 10,000 years had made the crusade into something that does not require any Primarch's blessing to continue, because it was never about the Primarchs. It was always about the Emperor, and the Emperor's silence on the matter is interpreted by the Black Templars not as absence, but as permission, the kind of permission that does not need to be spoken because it was spoken once, definitively, in the shape of the universe the Emperor built. In the very final analysis, the question, why do the Black Templars crusade, has the same answer it has always had. Not because Sigismund made a promise, not because their gene seed comes from Rogel Dorn, not even because the galaxy needs them to. All of those things are true, but they are true in the way that background facts are true. They're context, not cause. The cause, the actual reason, is simpler and more profound than any of those contextual facts. The Black Templars crusade because they are Black Templars, and being a Black Templar means crusading. And the meaning of the word means in that sentence is not analogical. It is literal. The crusade is the definition of the thing, not a description of what the thing does. Change the crusade, and you do not have a changed Black Templar. You have something else entirely. This is what Sigismund built when he made his oath and launched his fleet into the dark. Not just a chapter, not just a tradition, a form of being that could not cease without ceasing to be itself. A warrior culture so thoroughly organized around a single commitment that the commitment is not something the warriors have, it is something the warriors are. 10,000 years of that, and the wars ahead, and the faith that burns at the center of each warrior like a star that has never been cold. That is the Black Templars. That is the brutal life of a Black Templar. And it is, in every possible sense of the word, exactly what they choose. No pity, no remorse, no fear. The Eternal Crusade continues. Bonus section. Lesser-known crusades and the breadth of the Black Templar legacy. The battles we have focused on in this script, Hell's Reach, the First Black Crusade, the confrontations with Imhotep, the Stormlord, are the most famous and the most thoroughly documented, because they are the ones that entered the broader record of the Imperium's history. But the Black Templars have been fighting for 10,000 years, and the vast majority of that fighting does not appear in any history that most people would have occasion to read. The Theratos Crusade, at some point in the 41st millennium, saw the Black Templars burning a scar of retribution across the Inverness sector, where the Word-Bearers' Chaos Space Marine Legion had instigated a rebellion. The Word-Bearers launched their own fleet-based crusade in response, and the two forces clashed across 100 battlefields. Other traitor legions joined the conflict. Daemon hosts poured through the weakened reality. By the time both sides had exhausted themselves, 6 entire worlds of the once populous Inverness sector had been consumed by radioactive flame. The cost was enormous. The outcome was, by the brutal arithmetic of the 41st millennium, a success, because the Word-Bearers' heretical infestation had been purged along with everything else. The Benedictine War, in the 37th millennium, saw the Black Templars commit their entire chapter alongside 5 orders of the Sisters of Battle in a campaign to conquer alien-held worlds in the Benedictine subsector. 2 high marshals fell in the campaign. The ecclesiarch declared the war, successfully concluded, and called his forces home. The new High Marshal Constantine looked at the declaration of victory and continued the war anyway, because his assessment of what remained unconquered differed from the ecclesiarch's, and because the Black Templars do not stop because someone else has decided the job is done. The Crusade of Sorrow, in 955, M41 began when Dark Eldar raiders of the Cabal of the Poisoned Heart destroyed the chapter's keep on Delarant and took a score of newly recruited neophytes captive. Marshal Gerhardt and the Reclusiarch Grimaldus, who was at that point serving under the Reclusiarch Mordred before his later elevation, led a crusade of retribution against the Cabal. Hundreds of Dark Eldar were slaughtered across the raid that followed, their ships taken and burned, their fortress facilities in the Dark City attacked with a commitment of Black Templar firepower that made the raid one of the more dramatic incursions into Comora's webway-adjacent spaces on record. Not a single neophyte was ever found or recovered. The Dark Eldar had already done with them whatever Dark Eldar do with captives, which is not something that the chapter's records describe and which we should not examine too closely. The Veradon Crusade, in 987, M41, where the Black Templars attempted to come to the aid of the Shadow Wolves chapter, facing tyrannid extermination on their homeworld, represents a different kind of entry in the Black Templar record. Not a victory, not a purge conducted on their own terms, but an attempt at rescue that arrived too late and too slowly to change the outcome. The last battle brother of the Shadow Wolves died holding the chapter banner aloft, with his bolter empty and his blade broken as the Tyranids tore him apart. Grimaldus, present at the time as an apprentice under Mordred, was deeply affected by what he witnessed, describing it in accounts as the most glorious last stand he had ever seen. The impression it left on him shows in everything he later did at Hell's Reach. The absolute refusal to yield even when the rational assessment of the situation says the fight is already lost. The choice of the most sacred available ground for the final stand. The insistence on dying, if dying is what the Emperor requires, in a way that means something. The Shadow Wolves gave him a template. Hell's Reach gave him the opportunity to fulfill it. These campaigns, and hundreds more like them that we do not have time to examine here, compose the actual substance of what the Eternal Crusade is, across its full 10,000-year span. not a single grand narrative with a clear shape. A vast accumulation of engagements, some famous and some utterly obscure, some victorious in conventional terms, and some that produced only the specific, costly victory of refusing to break when breaking would have been easier. The Black Templars' history is too large to hold in a single viewing. What we have done here is walk around the edges of it and look at the parts that give the most revealing view of the whole. The whole is this: a chapter that has chosen, again and again, across 10,000 years and counting, to carry the weight of a promise that was never meant to be comfortable and was never meant to end. And they carry it still, in the dark between the stars. In the chapels of ships whose engines have not been silent since before any living person's grandfather was born. In the prayers of warriors who believe, with a completeness that no argument can reach, that what they do matters, and that the God Emperor sees it, and that the day's work, however brutal, however costly, however apparently futile in the largest view, is the right work. No pity, no remorse, no fear.